Hello history buffs and welcome back to the channel. Today we're kicking off a brand new series, a deep dive into the epic story of England. But wait a second, before we can talk about kings, castles, and the English we know, we need to wind the clock way back. Because long before there was an England, there was an island teeming with ancient mysteries, strange monuments, and fierce warriors. This is the story of prehistoric and Celtic Britain. So, how far back are we talking? Forget the Romans, forget the Anglo-Saxons. We're talking hundreds of thousands of years. The land we now call England was once a wild, untamed frontier, a place shaped by the raw power of nature. Massive ice sheets, glaciers miles thick, periodically advanced and retreated across the landscape, carving out valleys and reshaping the very coastline for vast stretches of time. It was uninhabitable, a frozen world locked in the grip of the Ice Age. But whenever the ice pulled back, life returned. Our earliest human relatives, ancient hominins, would venture into this land, following herds of mammoths, woolly rhinos, and giant deer. These weren't permanent settlers, they were nomadic hunters, living a tough existence on the edge of a changing world. They left behind tantalizing clues, flint handaxes, butchered animal bones, footprints fossilized in ancient mud. Each discovery is a tiny window into a life almost unimaginably different from our own. The real story of continuous settlement begins after the last great ice age finally ended, around 11,000 years ago. As the climate warmed, forests spread across the land, and Britain, which was still connected to mainland Europe by a land bridge, saw new waves of people arrive. These were the Mesolithic people, or Middle Stone Age people. They were skilled hunter-gatherers, adapting to the new woodland environment. They fished in the rivers, hunted red deer and wild boar in the forests, and gathered nuts and berries. They used tiny, expertly crafted flint tools called microliths, mounting them on arrows and spears. They were constantly on the move, following the seasons and the resources, living in small, family-based groups. Around 6,000 years ago, a revolutionary change swept across the island. This was the Neolithic Revolution, the dawn of the new Stone Age. People started farming. It's hard to overstate how massive this shift was. Instead of just hunting and gathering food, people began to control it. They cleared areas of forests to plant the first crops, like wheat and barley, and they herded domesticated animals like cattle, sheep, and pigs. For the first time, people started to settle down in one place, building more permanent homes and creating the first villages. Life was still hard, but it was more stable. This change didn't happen overnight. It was a slow process, but it laid the foundations for everything that would follow. And with this new, settled way of life came a new way of thinking about the world, about life, and about death. The Neolithic people were the first great builders. They began constructing incredible monuments, structures that still dominate the landscape today and fill us with awe. We're talking about long barrows, which were great earthen tombs for communities, and a new, mysterious type of structure, the stone circle. Of course, when you think of a stone circle, one name immediately springs to mind: Stonehenge, standing majestically on the Salisbury Plain. Stonehenge is the most famous prehistoric monument in the world, and for good reason. Its construction was a mind-boggling feat of engineering and organization, spanning over 1,000 years. The largest stones, the Saracens, were dragged from 20 miles away. The smaller blue stones, incredibly, were brought all the way from the Preseli Hills in Wales, over 150 miles away. How did they do it? And more importantly, why? Was it a temple to the sun? A celestial observatory to track the seasons? A place of healing? A sacred burial ground for a royal dynasty? The honest answer is, we don't know for sure. It was probably a mix of all these things, but what's clear is that it was immensely important to these people. It was a focal point for their society, a place where communities came together for rituals and ceremonies that connected them to the cosmos and to their ancestors. Stonehenge wasn't alone. Across Britain, people were building other amazing sites like the vast stone circles at Avebury or the chambered tomb of West Kennet Longbarrow. These monuments tell us that these were complex societies with deep spiritual beliefs and a powerful connection to the land. As the centuries rolled on, another new technology arrived. Metal, first bronze, then iron. The Bronze Age, starting around 2500 BC, saw the rise of a new culture. These people were skilled metalworkers crafting beautiful bronze axes, daggers, and intricate gold jewelry. Society seems to have become more hierarchical. Instead of communal tombs, we see more individual burials, often underground barrows with the deceased accompanied by rich grave goods. This suggests the emergence of powerful individuals, chieftains or warrior elites, who held status and wealth. Trade also flourished. British bronze and tin were valuable commodities, and we see artifacts from mainland Europe turning up in Britain, and British goods turning up abroad. The island was becoming more connected. Then, around 800 BC, came the Iron Age. Iron was stronger, more efficient, and more widely available than bronze. It changed warfare, with iron swords and spearheads, and it changed farming, with iron-tipped plows that could cultivate heavier soils. The people of the Iron Age are the ones we can finally put a name to, the Celts. Now, Celts is a broad term for the various tribes who spoke Celtic languages and shared a similar culture across much of Europe. In Britain, they weren't a single unified nation. Instead, the island was a patchwork of different tribes, like the Iceni in the east, the Brigantes in the north, and the Duratridges in the southwest. Life in Celtic Britain was centered on agriculture and settlement. Many people lived in small farming communities, in distinctive roundhouses made of timber with conical thatched roofs. But the most impressive feature of the Iron Age landscape is the hill fort. Hundreds of these were built across the country, massive defensive structures with huge earth ramparts and ditches. Places like Maiden Castle in Dorset are absolutely enormous, essentially fortified towns. Were they permanent residences for entire tribes? Were they safe places to retreat to in times of war? Or were they status symbols for powerful chieftains, a way to project power and control the surrounding land? Again, likely a bit of all three. Celtic society was tribal and often warlike, led by a warrior aristocracy who loved feasting, fighting, and showing off their wealth through ornate metalwork, beautifully decorated shields, helmets, and torques, which were heavy neck rings. They had a sophisticated culture, rich in art, music, and oral storytelling, and at the heart of their spiritual life were the Druids. The Druids were more than just priests. They were the keepers of wisdom, the judges, the teachers, and the advisors to the chieftains. They held immense power and prestige, presiding over religious ceremonies, which sometimes included human sacrifice, and passing down the sacred knowledge of the tribe through long memorized verses. They were the intellectual glue that held Celtic society together. By the 1st century BC, Britain was far from isolated. It had strong trade and cultural links with its Celtic cousins in Gaul, what is now France. Wine, pottery, and other luxury goods were being imported from the continent, and British tribes were issuing their own coinage. Southern Britain was a dynamic, complex, and wealthy place, but it was also divided. The various tribes were often rivals, competing for land, resources, and prestige. They were powerful, proud, and independent. But this division would ultimately be their weakness, because across the narrow sea, a new, single, unifying power was on the march, an empire of unprecedented scale, discipline, and ambition. Rome was coming, and the island of the Celts would never be the same again. For nearly 100 years after Julius Caesar's flashy raids, Britain remained a mysterious island on the edge of the known world. Caesar came, saw, and pretty much left. His expeditions in 55 and 54 BC were more about personal glory and political PR back in Rome than about actual conquest. He fought some local tribes, took some hostages, and declared victory, but didn't establish a permanent Roman presence. For the Britons, life went on, a patchwork of rival kingdoms, Iron Age farming, and warrior elites. But Rome never truly forgets. The idea of Britain, this wild, resource-rich land just across the Channel, lingered in the Roman imagination. Fast forward to AD 43, a new emperor, Claudius, sits on the throne in Rome. Unlike his glamorous predecessors, Claudius is often seen as an unlikely leader. He's older, has a limp, and a stutter. He desperately needs a major military victory to secure his position and command the respect of the army and the Senate. And what better target than the unconquered island of Britannia? So, he gives the order, a massive invasion force, for legions strong. That's about 40,000 professional soldiers assembled. Under the command of the brilliant General Aulus Plautius, they set sail for Britain. The legions landed in what is now Kent, and the real fight for Britain began. Unlike Caesar's hit-and-run tactics, this was a full-scale invasion aimed at total subjugation. The British tribes, led by powerful chieftains like Caratacus and Togodumnus, put up a fierce resistance. They were skilled warriors, fighting on their home turf. A major, two-day battle erupted at the River Medway. It was a brutal, bloody affair. The Romans, with their superior discipline, tactics, and equipment, eventually broke the British lines. They pushed on, crossing the River Thames and storming the enemy's heartlands. The capital of the powerful Cutovolinae tribe, Camulodunum, modern-day Colchester, fell within just a few years. The southeast of Britain was firmly under Roman control. The province of Britannia was born. Claudius himself even visited the new province, bringing elephants for a grand victory parade to cement his triumph. It was a PR masterstroke. With the military conquest underway, the Romans began what they did best, building an empire. They weren't just soldiers, they were engineers, architects, and administrators. They started to transform the very landscape of Britain. Out of a marshy settlement on the Thames, they built a bustling port and administrative center called Londinium. Today, we call it London. They established cities and towns across the island, many of which still exist. Camulodunum became the first provincial capital. Verulamium grew near modern St. Albans. Aquisules, with its famous natural hot springs, became the spa town we know as Bath. These weren't just random collections of buildings. Roman towns were laid out on a grid system with a central forum, basilica, public baths, and temples. For the local elite who chose to cooperate, life became very comfortable. They could live in luxurious villas with underfloor heating, intricate mosaics, and imported wine. The Romans were exporting a lifestyle, a new way of being civilized, to connect these new urban centers and move their armies quickly. They built an incredible network of dead straight roads. Famous routes like Watling Street and the Fossway crisscrossed the country, forming a skeleton that still underlies Britain's road network today. For the first time, the island was truly connected. But not everyone was happy to adopt Roman ways. Roman rule was often brutal and exploitative. Taxes were heavy, and Roman officials could be arrogant and corrupt. This simmering resentment exploded around AD 60 in one of the most famous and terrifying rebellions in British history. It was led by a woman, a warrior queen named Boudicca of the Iceni tribe. After her husband died, the Romans annexed his kingdom, publicly flogged Boudicca and assaulted her daughters. It was a profound humiliation, and it lit a fire of rebellion. Boudicca rallied her people and neighboring tribes, amassing a huge war host. They descended on the symbols of Roman power with absolute fury. Their first target was Camulodunum, the Roman capital. They burned it to the ground, slaughtering its inhabitants. Next, they marched on Londinium, the commercial hub. It too was destroyed, its people massacred. The same fate met Verulamium. Archaeologists today can still see the thick layer of burned red earth from Boudicca's destruction. For a moment, it looked as if Roman Britain was about to be wiped off the map. The Roman governor Suetonius Paulinus was campaigning in Wales at the time. He raced back with his legions to confront the rebellion. The two armies finally met somewhere along Watling Street. The Romans were massively outnumbered, perhaps 10 to 1, but they were professional soldiers with superior strategy. Paulinus chose his ground carefully, with a narrow front and woods protecting his flanks. The Britons, confident in their numbers, charged, but the narrow battlefield turned their numerical advantage into a weakness. The disciplined Roman legionaries held their line, hurled their javelins, and then advanced in a deadly organized wedge. The result was a horrific slaughter. Boudicca's army was annihilated. The rebellion was over. Boudicca herself is said to have taken poison rather than be captured. After the revolt was crushed, Roman rule was re-established, this time more firmly than ever. The southeast would not rise again. While the south of Britain became more settled and Romanized, the north remained a wild and contested frontier. The Romans pushed their control further and further north, clashing with the fierce tribes of what is now northern England and Scotland. The conquest was slow and costly. Generations of soldiers fought and died in these misty hills and bogs. Finally, under the Emperor Hadrian in the AD 120s, the Romans decided to draw a line. They built a wall. But this wasn't just any wall. Hadrian's wall was an incredible feat of engineering. It stretched 73 miles from coast to coast, a stone barrier complete with forts, mile castles and turrets, manned by thousands of auxiliary troops. It was more than just a defensive line. It was a powerful statement. It was the definitive edge of the Roman Empire. It marked the boundary between the order of Rome and the chaos of the barbarians beyond. For a while, they pushed even further north and built another barrier, the Antonine Wall, but they soon retreated back to the more defensible line of Hadrian's Wall. It remained the northern frontier for most of the Roman period in Britain. For the next 2 centuries, Roman Britain enjoyed a period of relative peace and prosperity, especially in the south. The economy boomed. Britain exported grain, cattle, metals like lead, silver, and gold, and even hunting dogs. The province became highly urbanized and sophisticated. Latin became the language of government and business, spoken alongside the native Celtic languages. People from all over the empire, merchants from Gaul, soldiers from Spain, artisans from Syria came to live and work in Britannia, making it a surprisingly multicultural society. A new religion also began to take hold. Christianity, which had started as a small sect in a distant corner of the empire, spread along the trade routes and military roads. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, it had a significant following in Britain. Churches were being built, and bishops from Britain even attended major church councils in other parts of the empire. Roman Britain was becoming a Christian province. But as the 4th century wore on, the foundations of the Roman world began to crack. The empire was vast, overstretched, and facing crises on multiple fronts. In Britain, raids from Picts in the north, Scots from Ireland, and Saxon pirates from across the North Sea became more frequent and more destructive. The coastal defenses, known as the Saxon shore forts, were built to counter this threat, but it was a constant struggle. At the same time, the empire was racked by civil wars, with ambitious generals repeatedly taking their legions from Britain to make a bid for the imperial throne, leaving the province dangerously undefended. The final break came at the beginning of the 5th century. The heart of the empire was under direct attack from Germanic tribes. Legions were being recalled from the frontiers to defend Italy itself. In the year 410, the Visigoths famously sacked the city of Rome, a shock that reverberated throughout the Roman world. The remaining Roman officials and troops in Britain were withdrawn. The Romano-British provincials, now facing increasing attacks on their own, sent a desperate appeal to the Emperor Honorius for help. The reply they received was stark and final. They were told to look to their own defense. After nearly 400 years, the eagles were leaving. Rome had abandoned Britain. The lighthouses went dark, the villas fell into disrepair, the underfloor heating grew cold. The people of Britain, who for centuries had lived as citizens of a global superpower, were now on their own. A new and uncertain age was dawning. Alright, let's dive into one of the most mysterious and chaotic periods in British history. Picture this, it's the early 5th century. For nearly 400 years, Britain has been Britannia, a province of the mighty Roman Empire. Roman roads, Roman villas, Roman laws, Roman legions keeping the peace. Then, in 410 AD, the Emperor Honorius sends a message. The empire's crumbling, Rome is under attack, and the legions in Britain are needed elsewhere. His message to the Britons is simple and terrifying. Look to your own defenses. And just like that, Rome was gone. So what happens when the superpower that has controlled your world for centuries packs up and leaves? The immediate aftermath isn't an instant collapse into barbarism. Instead, what we see is a sub-Roman Britain. The infrastructure is still there. The people living in the towns and villas are still remote. They speak a form of Latin. They have Roman-style administrations, and they try their best to keep the show on the road. Local elites, powerful families, and ambitious warlords step into the power vacuum left by the Roman governors. They raise their own private armies, they try to collect taxes, and they fight to defend their territories from raiders' pigs from the north, Scots from Ireland, and a new threat from across the North Sea. This is the world that gives birth to the legends of King Arthur, a Romano-British warlord, a duke of battles, leading cavalry against invaders, trying to hold back the tide and preserve a glimmer of civilization. Whether Arthur was a real person or a composite of several leaders, he represents that desperate heroic struggle to maintain order in a world falling apart. But the tide was impossible to hold back. For decades, Roman Britain had used Germanic mercenaries to help defend its shores. These soldiers, from tribes like the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes and the Frisians, were known for their ferocity. The Romano-British leaders, following this old playbook, hired these mercenaries to fight off the Picts and Scots. One famous story, recorded by the monk Gildas, tells of a British ruler named Vortigern inviting Saxon chieftains, Hengist and Horsa, to settle in Kent in exchange for military service. It was a deal with the devil. The mercenaries saw a rich, fertile land with a broken military and no central authority. They soon realized they didn't need to work for the Britons. They could work for themselves. They sent word back home, and what started as a trickle of mercenaries turned into a flood of migrants and invaders. From the mid-5th century onwards, whole families, entire communities, packed up their lives in what is now Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, and crossed the sea to Britain. This wasn't a single, coordinated invasion. It was a messy, piecemeal process of settlement, conflict, and cultural fusion that happened over generations. In some areas, it was likely violent conquest. Archaeological evidence shows towns being burned and abandoned. The native Romano Britons were killed or forced to flee, but in other places the process might have been more gradual. Anglo-Saxons may have settled on vacant land, or slowly integrated with and dominated the local population. The result of this migration was a dramatic redrawing of the map of Britain. The native Celtic-speaking Britons were steadily pushed west and north. They were driven into the mountainous, less desirable lands that would eventually become Wales, Cornwall, and the Kingdom of Strathclyde, in what is now southern Scotland and northern England. The name Wales actually comes from an Old English word Wellis, which meant foreigners or slaves. That's what the newcomers called the people who were there before them. Meanwhile, the fertile lowlands of the east and south were transformed. This area became Angleland or England. The language changed from Britannic, Celtic, and Latin to Old English, the ancestor of the language I'm speaking right now. The culture, laws, and social structures became Germanic. The elegant Roman villas were abandoned and fell into ruin, their intricate mosaics slowly covered by earth. The Anglo-Saxons preferred to live in wooden longhouses grouped into small villages. The stone cities of the Romans decayed, seen by the newcomers as the eerie, spooky work of giants. Out of this chaos, new power structures began to form. By the 7th century, a number of powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had emerged. Historians call them the Heptarchy, which means the 7 kingdoms, although the reality was a bit more complex. With smaller kingdoms and shifting allegiances, the main players were Kent, the first to be settled by the Jutes, Sussex and Wessex, the kingdoms of the South and West Saxons, Essex, the East Saxons, East Anglia, home of the Angles, and in the North and Midlands, the 2 powerhouses that would dominate the next few centuries, Northumbria and Mercia. For a long time, these kingdoms were pagan. They worshipped Germanic gods like Woden and Thor, the same gods that give us the names for Wednesday and Thursday. They had a warrior culture, valuing loyalty, bravery, and treasure won in battle. The famous Sutton, whose ship burial discovered in Suffolk, gives us a stunning glimpse into this world. A king sent to the afterlife in a 90-foot-long ship surrounded by magnificent treasures including an iconic helmet, swords, gold and silver from across the known world. But another monumental change was on the horizon. While the Britons in the West had held on to their Christian faith, paganism had taken over in England. That began to change in the year 597. Pope Gregory the Great in Rome, famously inspired after seeing fair-haired Angleboys in a slave market, decided it was time to bring England back into the Christian fold. He sent a mission of monks, led by a man named Augustine, to the most powerful kingdom in southern Britain at the time, Kent. The king of Kent, Ethelbert, was a pagan, but his wife Bertha was a Christian princess from the Frankish kingdom in modern-day France. This gave Augustine an opening. Ethelbert was cautious. He met Augustine and his monks outdoors, fearing they might use evil magic on him if they were under a roof. But Augustine's message was powerful. He wasn't a warrior with a sword. He was a missionary with a story of hope and salvation. Ethelbert was intrigued. He allowed the monks to preach in his capital of Canterbury, and before long, he himself converted and was baptized, becoming the first Christian Anglo-Saxon king. Augustine became the first Archbishop of Canterbury, a position that remains the head of the Church of England to this day. This was a pivotal moment. The conversion didn't happen overnight. It was a slow process, with frequent setbacks and pagan revivals, but the arrival of Christianity reconnected England to the intellectual and cultural world of mainland Europe. It brought back Latin, literacy, and the art of writing books and keeping records. Monasteries became centers of learning and art, producing incredible works like the Lindisfarne Gospels. The church provided a new, unifying ideology that could bind kingdoms together. It marked the beginning of the end for the Dark Ages and the dawn of a new, distinctively English civilization. From the ashes of Roman Britain, a new nation, forged from migration, conflict, and faith, was beginning to take shape, and the story of how these rival Anglo-Saxon kingdoms would eventually unite to face an even greater threat from the sea is a tale for next time. Imagine a time when England wasn't one country, but 7 fiercely competitive kingdoms. This was the Heptarchy, a 300-year Game of Thrones where power was constantly shifting. In the 7th and 8th centuries, the kingdom of Northumbria in the north was the superstar. It wasn't just a military power. It was the cultural heart of England. Monasteries like Lindisfarne and Jarrow were beacons of learning, home to brilliant minds like the Venerable Bede, who wrote the first history of the English people. Northumbria was a center of art, scholarship, and faith, producing stunning treasures like the Lindisfarne Gospels. Power eventually drifted south to the mighty kingdom of Mercia, which dominated central England. Its kings, like Arthur the Great, built massive earthworks to mark their territory and commanded respect across the land. The 7 kingdoms, Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex vied for supremacy, creating a complex and ever-changing political map. It seemed this internal struggle would define England's future. But then, something new and terrifying appeared on the horizon, a threat that would change everything. The year is 793. On the holy island of Lindisfarne, off the coast of Northumbria, life for the monks is quiet and predictable, a cycle of prayer, work, and study. But one day longships appear, their dragon-headed prows cutting through the waves. From these ships pour warriors from Scandinavia, the men we now call Vikings. They descend upon the unprepared monastery, looting its treasures, destroying its sacred relics, and killing or enslaving the monks. The news of the raid on Lindisfarne sent a shockwave across Christian Europe. How could such a holy place be so brutally desecrated? For the people of England, this was just the beginning. The Viking Age had arrived. At first, the raids were seasonal hit-and-run attacks. Vikings would strike coastal communities in the summer, load their ships with plunder, and sail home. But as the 9th century progressed, their ambitions grew. The raids turned into invasions. Small bands of pirates were replaced by massive armies, what the Anglo-Saxons called the Great Heathen Army. They came not just to raid, but to conquer and to stay. They landed in East Anglia in 865 and began a systematic takeover. Within a few years, the kingdoms that had dominated England for centuries began to fall like dominoes. Northumbria, the once great cultural powerhouse, was conquered. East Anglia's king was brutally martyred. The mighty kingdom of Mercia was torn apart, its eastern half falling under Viking control. The invaders established their own rule, laws, and customs in a vast territory that became known as the Danelaw, stretching across the north and east of England. By the 870s, only one Anglo-Saxon kingdom remained standing. Its back against the wall, fighting for its very survival, the kingdom of Wessex. With all other kingdoms either conquered or subjugated, the fate of England rested on the shoulders of Wessex and its young king, Alfred, when he took the throne in 871. The situation was desperate. The Great Heathen Army was at his doorstep, and in 878, they launched a surprise attack that forced Alfred to flee into the marshes of Somerset, a king without a kingdom. It was the lowest point in Anglo-Saxon history. It looked like the end. But Alfred was no ordinary king. From his marshland hideout he rallied his loyal followers, waging a guerrilla war against the occupiers. Then, in the spring of 878, he emerged with a newly gathered army and met the main Viking force at the Battle of Edington. The clash was decisive. Alfred won a spectacular victory. He didn't just defeat the Viking army, he pursued them to their fortress and besieged them until they surrendered. As part of the peace treaty, the Viking leader Guthrum agreed to be baptized as a Christian, with Alfred as his godfather. This was more than just a military victory. It was a symbolic one. The treaty established a formal boundary between Alfred's Wessex and the Danelaw, effectively splitting England in two. Alfred had saved his kingdom and, in doing so, had preserved a future for the English people. Alfred's victory at Edington secured Wessex, but he knew the threat was far from over. He wasn't just a warrior, he was a visionary. He realized that to prevent future disasters, he needed to fundamentally reform his kingdom. He started with defense. He created a network of fortified towns, or burhs, across his kingdom, ensuring that no one was more than a day's march from a place of safety. He reorganized his army, creating a standing force that could react quickly to threats. He also built a navy, the first of its kind in England, to meet the Vikings at sea before they could even land. But Alfred's vision went beyond military matters. He saw that the decades of war had destroyed the centers of learning and literacy that had once flourished. So, he embarked on an ambitious educational and cultural revival. He himself learned Latin and began translating important works into Old English so his people could read them. He invited scholars from across Britain and Europe to his court, turning Wessex into the new intellectual center of England. He also reformed the laws, creating a single law code for all his people. Through these reforms, Alfred didn't just save Wessex, he laid the foundations for a unified, educated, and well-defended English nation. For this, history remembers him as Alfred the Great. The work begun by Alfred the Great was carried on by his children and grandchildren. His son Edward the Elder and his formidable daughter Thelfeld, the Lady of the Mercians, began the reconquest of the Danelaw. They pushed the boundaries of Saxon rule northwards, capturing Viking-held towns and building new fortresses. They were brilliant military strategists, working in tandem to systematically dismantle Viking power in the Midlands and East Anglia. The final piece of the puzzle fell to Alfred's grandson Athelstan ascending to the throne in 925. Athelstan was a king of immense ambition and military prowess. He didn't just want to rule Wessex and Mercia, he wanted to rule all of England. In 900, he marched his army north and conquered the last remaining Viking kingdom on English soil, the powerful kingdom of York. For the first time, a single ruler controlled the entire landmass we now call England. On his charters and coins, he was styled Rex Totius Britanniae, King of all Britain. Although there would be more conflict and even a brief return of Viking kings a century later, Athelstan's conquest of York was the pivotal moment. The dream of a united England, born from the struggle against a common enemy and forged by the vision of Alfred and his descendants, had finally become a reality. The age of competing kingdoms was over, and the Kingdom of England had begun.
By the late 10th century, England had become a very attractive prize. It was wealthy, organized, and ripe for the picking. And the Vikings noticed. Again, after a relatively peaceful period, new waves of Scandinavian attacks began, and the man on the throne, King Thellard, wasn't quite up to the task. History remembers him as Thellard the Unready, which is a bit of a mistranslation. His Old English nickname, Unread, actually means ill-advised or no counsel, which paints a picture of a king who received terrible advice and made poor decisions. And his biggest decision? To pay off the raiders. This payment was called the Danegeld, and it was a massive fortune paid to the Viking fleets to get them to go away. Think of it like a national protection racket. The problem is, when you pay someone to leave you alone, they tend to come back for more. The Danegeld payments grew larger and larger, draining the kingdom's treasury and showing the world just how rich and how vulnerable England really was. Tensions escalated dramatically. In 1002, a desperate Thellard ordered the St. Brice's Day massacre, a killing of Danish settlers living in England. This was a catastrophic mistake. Not only was it a brutal act, but it also provoked a furious response. One of the victims was rumored to be the sister of Sweyn Forkbeard, the King of Denmark. Sweyn launched a series of devastating invasions, not just for plunder, but for outright conquest. For years, England was ravaged by war. By 1013, Sweyn had conquered the country, forcing Thellard to flee into exile in Normandy. Although Sweyn died shortly after, the fight was continued by his son, Canute. Canute, known to history as Canute the Great, was a formidable and clever ruler. After a period of intense fighting against Lulred's son, Edmund Ironside, the two agreed to divide England. But then, conveniently for Canute, Edmund died just weeks later. And so, in 1016, the Danish king Canute became the undisputed king of all England. But Canute's ambition didn't stop there. He created a vast North Sea empire, ruling over England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden. For a time, London was the center of a Scandinavian superstate. Canute was actually a good king for England. He brought peace and stability, respected Anglo-Saxon laws and customs, and protected the country from further Viking raids. He proved that a foreign ruler could be accepted if they brought security and prosperity. His reign was a golden age of Anglo-Scandinavian culture. However, Canute's empire was held together by his personal power. After he died and his sons' reigns proved short and chaotic, the old Anglo-Saxon royal line was restored. In 1042, Thelard the Unready's son, who had been exiled in Normandy for decades, returned to claim the throne. This was Edward the Confessor. Edward was a deeply pious and well-meaning man, but he had one major problem. He had no children. As his long reign wore on, the question of who would succeed him became the most dangerous political issue in Europe. The lack of a clear heir created a power vacuum, and several powerful men across the continent began to eye the English crown. England was still rich, and the throne was up for grabs. The three main contenders were Harold Godwinson, the most powerful earl in England, William, the Duke of Normandy, and Harold Hardrada, the King of Norway. Harold Godwinson was an Anglo-Saxon nobleman, brother to the Queen and Edward's right-hand man. On his deathbed in January 1066, King Edward supposedly named Harold as his successor. The English council, the Witan, agreed, and Harold Godwinson was crowned king almost immediately. Case closed, right? Not quite. Across the English Channel, William, the Duke of Normandy, was furious. William claimed that years earlier, King Edward had promised the throne to him. He also claimed that Harold Godwinson himself had once been shipwrecked in Normandy and had sworn a sacred oath to support William's claim. To William, Harold was a usurper and an oath-breaker. He began assembling a massive invasion fleet to take what he believed was his by right. And then there was the third claimant, Harold Hardrada of Norway. His name literally means hard ruler, and he was one of the most feared warriors of the Viking Age. His claim was more complicated, based on an old deal between his predecessor and one of Canute's sons. With a massive army of his own, Hardrada saw this as his chance to reunite England with the Scandinavian Empire, just as Canute had done. He allied himself with Harold Godwinson's exiled and bitter brother Tostig, and prepared to invade from the north. So in 1066, England faced a crisis of epic proportions. Two massive invasion fleets were preparing to strike from opposite directions. King Harold Godwinson knew he was in a desperate situation. He gathered his army, the famous Anglo-Saxon housecarls, and the militia called the Fyrd, and positioned them on the south coast, waiting for William's invasion. They waited all summer. The winds in the Channel were unfavorable for the Norman fleet. As weeks turned into months, Harold's supplies ran low, and his militia, who were farmers, needed to get home for the harvest. In early September, he made the fateful decision to disband his southern army. Literally days later, the news arrived. Harold Hardrada and the Norwegian army had landed in the north. They had already defeated a local English army and taken the city of York. Harold Godwinson had to act fast. He reassembled his core army of elite housecarls and marched them north at incredible speed, covering nearly 200 miles in about 4 days. On September 25th, he surprised the Norwegian army at a place called Stamford Bridge. The Vikings were caught completely off guard. Many weren't even wearing their full armor. The battle was a bloody and decisive English victory. Both Harold Hardrada and Harold's rebellious brother Tostig were killed. The Viking threat to England was ended, once and for all. It was a stunning triumph for King Harold. He had defeated one of the most legendary warriors of the age. But he had no time to celebrate. Because just 3 days after his victory at Stamford Bridge, the winds in the English Channel finally changed. William, Duke of Normandy, landed his army unopposed on the coast of Sussex. The news reached Harold as he was still in the north. Wounded and exhausted, his army had to turn around and march another 250 miles south to face a brand new enemy. It's one of the most incredible forced marches in military history. On October 14, 1066, the two armies met on a hillside near the town of Hastings. Harold's exhausted but battle-hardened English army took a strong defensive position at the top of the hill, forming a tight shield wall. For most of the day, William's attacks failed. His knights charged up the hill, only to be repulsed by the wall of shields and axes. At one point, a rumor spread that William had been killed, and the Normans almost broke. William had to ride through his troops, lifting his helmet to show he was alive, and rally them. The battle raged for hours, a brutal stalemate. The turning point came when the Normans, either by trickery or by accident, pretended to retreat. Some of the English soldiers, eager for victory, broke from their shield wall and charged down the hill after them. It was a fatal error. The Norman knights turned around and cut them to pieces. With gaps now appearing in the English line, the Normans could press their advantage. As evening fell, a stray arrow fired high into the air struck King Harold in the eye. He fell, and the last of the English resistance crumbled. The battle was over. The Anglo-Saxon king was dead. William marched to London, and on Christmas Day 1066, he was crowned William I, King of England in Westminster Abbey. He would forever be known as William the Conqueror. The Norman Conquest was complete. It wasn't just a change of king. It was a total transformation of the country. The Anglo-Saxon ruling class was almost entirely replaced by a French-speaking Norman elite. The language, the laws, the architecture, and the entire social structure of England were changed forever. The events of 1066 severed England's long-standing ties with Scandinavia and bound it tightly to the continent of Europe, setting the stage for centuries of rivalry with France and shaping the nation we know today. In 1066, William, Duke of Normandy, crossed the English Channel, defeated King Harold at the Battle of Hastings, and seized the throne. But this wasn't just a change of king. It was a total revolution led by a foreign warrior elite. England would never be the same again. So, how do you control a conquered nation that outnumbers you and sees you as an invader? For William the Conqueror, the answer was simple: stone and steel. The English landscape was soon dominated by a new and terrifying sight, the Norman castle. From the mighty Tower of London to countless smaller Motte and Bailey forts scattered across the countryside, these were not grand palaces but brutalist military outposts. They were bases for Norman garrisons, symbols of power designed to intimidate the local population and crush any thoughts of rebellion. And there were rebellions, especially in the north. William's response was swift and merciless. The Harrying of the North, from 1069 to 1070, was a campaign of such devastation, burning villages and destroying crops that it left the region scarred for generations and cemented Norman authority through sheer terror. Once the initial conquest was secure, William needed to figure out exactly what he had conquered. He needed to know who owned what, how much it was worth, and how much tax he could squeeze out of it. The result was one of the most remarkable documents in European history, the Domesday Book. Commissioned in 1085, this was a nationwide audit on an unprecedented scale. Royal commissioners traveled to every county, holding public inquiries and local courts to record every single manor, its owner, its value, the number of peasants, plows, and even pigs. It was an astonishing feat of administrative genius, providing a detailed snapshot of late 11th century England. For the English people, it was a day of judgment, hence its name, Doomsday, a final, unchangeable record of their new reality under Norman lords. For William, it was the ultimate tool of governance, ensuring his kingdom's wealth flowed directly to his treasury. The Domesday Book also reveals the single most dramatic social change of the era, the almost complete annihilation of the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy. Within a single generation, the old English earls and thanes were gone. Their lands were confiscated and handed out to William's loyal Norman, Breton, and Flemish followers. A new French-speaking elite now ruled England. This created a massive cultural and linguistic divide. At court, in law, and among the powerful, the language was now Anglo-Norman French. Old English, the language of Beowulf and the common people, was relegated to the status of a peasant tongue. It would survive, of course, but when it re-emerged centuries later, it would be profoundly changed, infused with thousands of French words. Words we still use today like government, parliament, justice, castle, and army are all direct linguistic legacies of the Norman Conquest. This Norman takeover extended to the most powerful institution of the medieval world, the Church. William saw the English Church as insular and in need of reform, and also as a potential source of opposition. He systematically replaced Anglo-Saxon bishops and abbots with his own Norman churchmen. One of the most significant appointments was Lanfranc of Bec, a brilliant Italian scholar, who became the Archbishop of Canterbury. Under Lanfranc, the English Church was reorganized along Norman lines, more closely tied to the authority of the Pope in Rome, and councils were held to enforce stricter clerical discipline. But the most visible legacy of this Normanization of the Church is architectural. The Normans were master builders. They tore down old Anglo-Saxon cathedrals and began constructing magnificent new ones in the grand, solid and imposing Romanesque style. The soaring naves and rounded arches of cathedrals like Durham, Winchester, and Ely are enduring monuments to Norman power, ambition, and piety, built to inspire awe in God and obedience to their new masters. After William the Conqueror died in 1087, the kingdom he had forged was put to the test. Norman rule was built on the strength of the monarch, and when that strength faltered, chaos threatened. William's sons, Robert Curthose, William Rufus, and Henry I, squabbled over the inheritance of England and Normandy. While William Rufus and Henry I were strong rulers who maintained control, the real crisis came after Henry's death in 1135. His only legitimate son had died in a shipwreck, leaving his daughter, the Empress Matilda, as his named heir. This was a radical idea for the 12th century, and many Norman barons refused to accept a queen. Instead, they backed Henry's nephew, Stephen of Blois. What followed was a devastating period of civil war known as the Anarchy. For nearly 2 decades, England was torn apart as the factions of Stephen and Matilda fought for control. Barons switched sides, castles were besieged, and law and order collapsed. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle grimly reported that men said openly that Christ and his saints were asleep. This period of turmoil starkly illustrated the fundamental weakness of the Norman system. It depended entirely on a strong king to hold the powerful, land-hungry barons in check. Without one, the kingdom could easily fracture. The anarchy finally ended in 1153 with the Treaty of Wallingford. A compromise was reached. Stephen would remain king for the rest of his life, but Matilda's son, a young and dynamic man named Henry Plantagenet, would be his heir. When Stephen died the following year, Henry of Anjou became King Henry II, ushering in the Great Plantagenet dynasty. The Norman era, strictly speaking, was over, but its legacy was profound and permanent. The Normans had reshaped England's political, social, and physical landscape. They created a powerful, centralized monarchy, a new aristocracy, a transformed church, and a language forever altered. They had bound England more tightly to the continent, setting the stage for centuries of conflict and connection with France. The Anglo-Saxon world was gone, and in its place was a hybrid, dynamic, and often turbulent kingdom, Anglo-Norman England, the foundation of the nation we know today. We're talking about the Angevin kings. It all starts in 1154 with Henry II. Remember Matilda, the empress who fought a long civil war for the throne? Well, Henry was her son. And when he became King of England, he wasn't just king of this island. He was already Count of Anjou and Duke of Normandy. He also married the incredible Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women in Europe. Together, their lands stretched from the Scottish border all the way down to the Pyrenees Mountains in Spain. Historians call this vast collection of territories the Angevin Empire. It was huge, powerful, and a constant challenge to manage. Henry II wasn't just a conqueror. He was a reformer, especially when it came to law. He wanted to create a unified legal system for all of England, a system where the king's justice was supreme. This led to the development of what we now call common law, a legal system common to the whole kingdom, based on precedent and royal court decisions. He introduced traveling judges called justices in eyre, who would roam the country hearing cases. This made justice more accessible and standardized, taking power away from local feudal lords who often ran their own little legal fiefdoms. He also formalized the jury system, using groups of local men to investigate crimes and decide on property disputes. It was a revolutionary step towards the legal systems many of us live under today. But Henry's ambition to control everything in his kingdom led to one of the most famous conflicts in English history. He clashed with his own friend, Thomas Becket, whom he had appointed as Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the church in England. Henry wanted the church courts to be under his royal authority. He felt it was unfair that clergymen who committed crimes could be tried in the more lenient church courts and escape royal punishment. Becket, once a loyal chancellor, fiercely defended the church's independence. He argued that only God, through the church, could judge a man of the cloth. This argument raged for years. Becket fled into exile, and the conflict grew more and more bitter. Eventually, Becket returned to England, but the tension remained. In a moment of sheer frustration, King Henry is famously said to have roared, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 of his knights took him at his word. They rode to Canterbury Cathedral, found Becket praying, and brutally murdered him right there on the altar steps in 1170. The shock and horror of this act echoed across all of Christendom. A holy man, an archbishop, murdered in his own cathedral. The Pope was outraged. Public opinion turned massively against Henry. Becket was almost immediately declared a martyr. and a saint, and his tomb at Canterbury became the most important pilgrimage site in England. Henry was forced into a humiliating public penance, walking barefoot through the streets of Canterbury and allowing himself to be whipped by monks. He had to back down on his plans to control the church. It was a dramatic lesson in the limits of royal power when faced with the authority of faith. Henry's troubles didn't end there. His later years were plagued by rebellions from his own family. He and Eleanor of Aquitaine had several sons, including Henry the Young King, Richard, Geoffrey, and John. These devil's brood, as they were sometimes called, were ambitious and impatient. Encouraged by their mother Eleanor and sometimes by the King of France, they repeatedly rose in revolt against their own father, demanding more power, more land, and more titles. Henry spent the end of his reign fighting his own children. He died a bitter, broken man, famously lamenting that the son he loved most, John, had also betrayed him. After Henry's death in 1189, his most famous son, Richard, took the throne. We know him today as Richard the Lionheart, and his nickname says it all. He was a formidable warrior, a brilliant military strategist, and the very model of a chivalrous knight. But that's the thing about Richard the Lionheart. He wasn't a very English king. He spent almost his entire 10-year reign outside of England. He famously said he would sell London if he could find a buyer just to fund his ambitions. And what were those ambitions? The Crusades. Richard was obsessed with the idea of retaking Jerusalem from the great Muslim leader Saladin. He poured all of England's resources into funding the Third Crusade. He fought with incredible bravery in the Holy Land, winning several key battles, but ultimately failed to capture Jerusalem. On his way home, he was captured and held for a massive ransom. England was bled dry raising the money to free its king. He finally returned for a brief period before heading back to France to defend his Angevin territories, where he was killed in 1199 by a crossbow bolt while besieging a minor castle. In 10 years as king, he spent only about 6 months in England. He was a legendary crusader, but his absence left a power vacuum and a massive financial strain on his kingdom. That brings us to his younger brother, John, who became king in 1199. If Richard is the hero of the story, John is almost always cast as the villain. And to be fair, he had a lot of problems, many of his own making. First, he was not the military genius his brother was. He quickly lost Normandy and most of the other Angevin lands in France to the French king Philip Augustus. This loss was a huge blow to the prestige of the English monarchy and earned him the unfortunate nickname, John Softsword. Losing his French lands meant losing a major source of income. To make up for it and to fund his attempts to win the territories back, John taxed England relentlessly. He squeezed his barons for every penny he could get, using feudal laws and new and aggressive ways to extract money. This made him incredibly unpopular. Then he got into a massive argument with the Pope, just like his father had. This time it was over who should be the next Archbishop of Canterbury. The dispute got so bad that the Pope placed all of England under an interdict, meaning no church services could be held. No marriages, no baptisms, no Christian burials. For the deeply religious people of the 13th century, this was a spiritual catastrophe. The Pope even excommunicated John himself, effectively declaring him an enemy of the church. Eventually, John had to give in completely, even declaring England a papal fiefdom, a huge humiliation. By 1215, King John had alienated everyone. He'd lost his empire, angered the Pope, and most importantly, pushed his barons too far. They were tired of the heavy taxes, the arbitrary punishments, and the king's belief that he could do whatever he wanted. A group of powerful barons rebelled. They weren't trying to overthrow John, but to force him to obey the law. They cornered him at a meadow by the River Thames called Runnymede in June 1215. There, they forced him to affix his royal seal to a document they had prepared, a list of demands. This document was the Great Charter, or in Latin, Magna Carta. Now, Magna Carta was not a revolutionary declaration of rights for all people. It was primarily a practical document written by barons, for barons to protect their own interests. It addressed specific grievances, unfair taxes, abuses of feudal law, and the king's arbitrary justice. But buried within its clauses were principles of monumental importance. One of the most famous clauses declared that no free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. This established the idea of due process and trial by jury. Even more fundamentally, Magna Carta established a core principle: the king himself is not above the law. The king must govern according to the established laws of the kingdom, and if he fails to do so, his subjects have the right to hold him accountable. A council of 25 barons was even set up to ensure John kept his promises. Of course, neither side truly intended to stick to the deal. John immediately got the Pope to annul the charter, and England plunged into a civil war known as the First Barons' War. John died the following year, in the middle of the conflict, but the idea of Magna Carta did not die with him. It was reissued by his young son, Henry III, and confirmed multiple times over the centuries. It transformed from a failed peace treaty into a powerful symbol. It became the foundational document for the idea that government should be limited, that power should be balanced, and that every individual has rights that even a monarch cannot take away. This idea would echo down the centuries, influencing the development of Parliament in England, and much later, inspiring the American Revolution and the United States Constitution. From the dramatic clash of the Angevin kings and their barons came a document that laid the groundwork for liberty and law as we know it today. The ink was barely dry, and the barons were already in open rebellion again. This set the stage for a century of conflict, but also for one of the most important innovations in political history: the birth of Parliament. King John's son, Henry III, inherited this mess. His long reign was plagued by the same old problems: broke king, angry barons. The barons, led by a charismatic figure named Simon de Montfort, weren't just fighting for their own rights anymore. They were starting to think about a better way to govern the whole country. In 1264, after capturing the king, de Montfort did something radical. He summoned a council, not just of barons and bishops, but also of knights from the shires and, for the first time, ordinary townsmen burgesses from the major towns. This wasn't a true parliament as we know it, but it was a revolutionary step. For the first time, commoners were invited to have a say in the running of the kingdom. De Montfort's rebellion was eventually crushed, and he was killed in battle, but his idea lived on. The man who crushed him was Henry's son, the future Edward I, one of England's most formidable kings. Edward was a paradox, a brutal warrior and a brilliant lawmaker. He learned from de Montfort's rebellion. He understood that to rule effectively and, more importantly, to raise taxes without constant civil war, he needed the consent of the realm. So in 1295, he summoned what became known as the Model Parliament. It was called Model because it set the template for the future. Like de Montfort's, it included barons, clergy, knights, and townsmen. Edward's motive was simple: what touches all should be approved by all. And by what touches all, he mostly meant taxes for his wars. This established the crucial principle of parliamentary consent for taxation, laying the foundation for the House of Lords and the House of Commons. While the king was still very much in charge, the seed of representative government had been firmly planted. Edward was a king with grand ambitions, and his gaze turned to his neighbors. First, Wales. For centuries, the Welsh princes had fiercely defended their mountainous homeland against English encroachment. Edward was determined to end this once and for all. He launched a massive, ruthless invasion, a blitzkrieg of its time. But conquest wasn't enough. He wanted to secure it. So he began one of the most expensive and impressive castle-building programs in European history. Mighty fortresses like Caernarfon, Conwy, and Harlech rose up, stone symbols of English domination. These weren't just military bases. They were administrative centers and royal palaces designed to awe the Welsh into submission. To complete his victory, in a powerful symbolic gesture, Edward proclaimed his own infant son as the first English Prince of Wales, a title the heir to the British throne holds to this day. Wales was now effectively part of England. Flushed with his success in Wales, Edward turned his attention north to Scotland. He saw an opportunity to become overlord of the entire island of Great Britain. The Scottish throne was vacant, and Edward, acting as arbitrator, chose a new king, John Balliol, whom he expected to be his puppet. But the Scots were not so easily tamed. They resented English interference, and soon resistance ignited into a full-blown war for independence. This was the era of legends. A knight of modest means, William Wallace, emerged as a leader, inflicting a shocking defeat on the English army at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Wallace became the guardian of Scotland, a symbol of defiance. His eventual capture and brutal execution in London were meant to break the Scottish spirit, but it had the opposite effect. It created a martyr. The flame of rebellion was picked up by another man, Robert the Bruce, a claimant to the Scottish throne. He was cunning, ruthless, and patient. After years of guerrilla warfare, hiding in the heather and waging a war of attrition, Bruce faced the English army at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. Against all odds, the smaller Scottish force crushed the mighty English army, securing a victory that would guarantee Scotland's independence for the next 400 years. Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, had died before this final showdown, but his dream of a united kingdom under his rule died with his army at Bannockburn. The border between England and Scotland would remain a place of war and conflict for centuries to come. Amidst these grand conflicts of kings and kingdoms, there was a darker chapter unfolding within England itself. This period saw a dramatic escalation in the persecution of England's Jewish community. For centuries, Jewish people had been a vital part of the economy, often serving as moneylenders, a role forbidden to Christians. This made them both indispensable and deeply resented. They were the king's property, protected by him, but also subject to his whims and crippling taxes. Kings would squeeze the Jewish community for cash, then turn a blind eye as popular anger, fueled by religious prejudice and economic jealousy, boiled over. Edward I tightened the screws. He restricted their lending, forced them to wear a special identifying badge, and levied impossible taxes. Finally, in 1290, he made a drastic decision. Edward expelled all Jews from England. It was the first time a European kingdom had permanently banished its entire Jewish population. They wouldn't be officially allowed to return for over 350 years. It was a cruel and short-sighted act, driven by a combination of religious intolerance and financial greed, and it left a dark stain on Edward's legacy. So this was a century of profound change. The rebellious spirit that produced Magna Carta evolved, almost by accident, into the beginnings of Parliament, a system that would one day hold kings to account. Ambitious monarchs expanded the borders of their kingdom, brutally subjugating Wales and failing spectacularly to do the same in Scotland, forging national identities in the process. And through it all, we see the power of ideas, the idea of representation, the idea of national freedom, and tragically, the idea of religious exclusion.
Imagine a century-long war, a devastating plague that reshapes society, and a massive popular uprising that threatens to topple the old order. This isn't a fantasy novel. This is the real story of England from 1337 to 1453. So grab a seat, because things are about to get intense. It all kicks off in 1337 with the start of the 100 Years' War. Now, the name is a bit misleading. It wasn't one continuous conflict, but a series of brutal wars fought between England and France. The root of the problem? The English kings, who were descended from Norman French nobility, believed they had a legitimate claim to the French throne itself. King Edward III of England looked across the Channel and thought, "That crown should be mine." And so began a conflict that would define generations. In the early stages, it seemed like England had a secret weapon, the longbow. This simple yet deadly piece of wood could launch arrows faster and farther than the crossbows used by many French soldiers. At battles like Crises in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356, English armies, often outnumbered, used their longbowmen to unleash devastating volleys of arrows, cutting down heavily armored French knights before they could even get close. These victories were shocking. They demonstrated a shift in military tactics, where disciplined archers could defeat the elite aristocratic cavalry that had dominated medieval battlefields for centuries. For England, it was a source of immense national pride. They captured the French king at Poitiers and secured a massive ransom. It felt like they were on top of the world. But just as England was celebrating its military triumphs, a far more terrifying enemy arrived, one that no army could fight. In 1348, ships docking in English ports brought with them an invisible passenger, the bacterium Yersinia pestis. This was the beginning of the Black Death. The plague spread like wildfire through the cramped, unsanitary towns and villages of medieval England. The symptoms were horrific, and the speed at which it killed was terrifying. Within a year, it had swept across the entire country. Historians estimate that the Black Death wiped out anywhere from a third to half of England's population. Imagine every other person you know gone. The social and economic consequences were profound and immediate. With so many people dead, there was a sudden massive labor shortage. For the first time, peasants and laborers found themselves in a position of power. They could demand higher wages for their work because landowners were desperate for people to farm their fields. If one lord refused to pay, they could simply pack up and go to the next estate where someone would gladly meet their price. The old feudal system, which tied peasants to the land, was starting to crack. Naturally, the ruling class wasn't happy about this. The wealthy elite, the lords and nobles, saw their power and profits slipping away. They tried to fight back. In 1351, Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers, a law that attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and made it illegal for peasants to leave their master's land. It was a desperate attempt to turn back the clock and force society back into its old, rigid structure. But you can't legislate away supply and demand. The law was widely ignored and deeply resented. It sowed the seeds of deep-seated anger and social tension. The poor felt the rich were trying to cheat them out of the one opportunity they had to improve their lives. This simmering resentment finally boiled over in the summer of 1381. The catalyst was a new series of poll taxes, a flat tax levied on every adult. For the poor, this was the final straw. It was a deeply unfair tax that hit them the hardest. A massive uprising, known as the Peasants' Revolt, erupted in the southeast of England. Led by figures like Wat Tyler, a charismatic leader, and John Ball, a radical priest who preached that all people were equal, tens of thousands of rebels marched on London. They weren't just protesting a tax. They were challenging the entire feudal system. They burned down manor houses, destroyed tax records, and demanded an end to serfdom. When the rebels reached London, they caused chaos, targeting symbols of the government and the church. The young King Richard II, only 14 years old, bravely rode out to meet them. He promised to grant their demands, including the abolition of serfdom. But it was a trap. During a second meeting, Wat Tyler was killed by the mayor of London, and the king regained control. The revolt was brutally crushed, and its leaders were executed. On the surface, it seemed like a failure. But the idea of freedom and social justice had been planted. The ruling class was terrified. They realized there was a limit to how far they could push the common people, and while serfdom wasn't abolished overnight, the revolt accelerated its decline. The old feudal bonds were irrevocably weakened. Meanwhile, the war with France rumbled on. After a period of relative peace, the conflict flared up again in the early 1400s under a new, ambitious English king, Henry V. Henry was a charismatic and ruthless military leader, and he was determined to finish what Edward III had started. He renewed the English claim to the French throne and launched a new invasion of France. This led to one of the most legendary battles in English history, the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. Henry's army was small, exhausted, and riddled with disease. They were cornered by a much larger French force on a muddy field. Against all odds, the English achieved a stunning victory. Once again, the longbow was the star. The French knights, bogged down in the mud, were slaughtered by relentless arrow storms. Agincourt became a symbol of English grit and defiance, a story of the underdog triumphing against impossible odds. It made Henry V a national hero. Riding this wave of success, Henry continued his campaign, conquering large parts of northern France. In 1420, he achieved his ultimate goal. He forced the French king to sign the Treaty of Troyes. This treaty was incredible. It disinherited the French heir and named Henry V and his future children as the successors to the French throne. It looked like England had finally won the 100 Years' War. Henry even married the French king's daughter to seal the deal. The crowns of England and France were set to be united, but history has a funny way of turning things upside down. Just 2 years later, at the height of his power, Henry V died suddenly of dysentery. His son, Henry VI, was just an infant. The dream of a united kingdom fell apart almost immediately. England was now led by a baby king and factious, squabbling nobles. The English hold on France began to weaken. And then, the French found their own hero. A young peasant girl named Joan of Arc came forward, claiming she had divine visions telling her to drive the English out of France. She inspired the demoralized French army and led them to a series of incredible victories, most famously lifting the English siege of Orleans in 1429. Her intervention completely turned the tide of the war. Although she was eventually captured and executed by the English, her spirit galvanized French resistance. Under the weak and ineffective rule of Henry VI, the English war effort in France collapsed. One by one, the towns and territories they had fought so hard to win were recaptured by the French. The final blow came in 1453 with the English defeat at the Battle of Castellon. After more than a century of conflict, the war was over, and England had lost. Of all their vast French possessions, only the port city of Calais remained in their hands. So, what was the legacy of this turbulent century? England emerged a changed nation. The war had forged a stronger sense of English identity separate from the French. The Black Death and the Peasants' Revolt had shattered the old feudal order, paving the way for a more modern society with a free peasantry. But the defeat in France and the disastrous reign of Henry VI left the English nobility bitter, divided, and armed. The stage was set for another bloody conflict, but this time the English would be fighting each other. This wasn't just a war. It was a brutal 30-year family feud that tore the kingdom apart and ultimately forged a new dynasty. So grab your popcorn, because this story has more twists, betrayals, and backstabbing than a season finale of your favorite drama. The year is 1455. England is in turmoil. The long and disastrous 100 Years' War with France has finally ended, not with a bang, but with a whimper. English territories in France are lost, national pride is wounded, and the royal court is a viper's nest of ambition and discontent. Sitting uneasily on the throne is King Henry VI of the House of Lancaster. Henry was a pious and gentle man, but he was far from the strong, decisive leader England needed. He suffered from bouts of mental illness, which often left him completely unresponsive, creating a massive power vacuum at the very heart of the kingdom. This is where our other key player enters the scene, Richard, Duke of York. Richard was a powerful nobleman and a direct descendant of King Edward III, just like Henry VI. In fact, many believed his claim to the throne was stronger than the king's. As Henry's mental state deteriorated, Richard was appointed protector of the realm. This taste of power, combined with the incompetence of the Lancastrian government led by Henry's formidable wife, Margaret of Anjou, set the stage for a collision course. The two great branches of the Plantagenet dynasty, the House of Lancaster, whose symbol was the red rose, and the House of York, symbolized by the white rose, were now on a path to war. The first clash came at the Battle of St. Albans in 1455. It was a Yorkist victory, and while it wasn't intended to depose the king just yet, it drew the first blood and solidified the battle lines. For the next 3 decades, England was plunged into a dizzying cycle of violence. It was a civil war fought not by the common people, but primarily by the nobility and their private armies. Loyalties shifted like sand. A nobleman might fight for Lancaster one year and York the next, depending on who offered the better deal or who seemed more likely to win. Battles were won and lost, towns were sacked, and the aristocracy was decimated. The throne itself became a deadly game of musical chairs. The Lancastrians would win a battle, and Richard of York would be forced to flee. Then the Yorkists would gain the upper hand, capture King Henry VI, and place him under their protection. Richard of York himself was killed at the Battle of Wakefield in 1460, his head mockingly adorned with a paper crown and displayed on the walls of York. It seemed like a decisive blow for Lancaster. But the Yorkist cause didn't die with him. It was taken up with a vengeance by his charismatic and capable eldest son, Edward. Edward was everything Henry VI was not: tall, handsome, a brilliant military commander, and utterly ruthless. In 1461, after a series of stunning victories, he marched into London, was proclaimed King Edward IV, and crushed the Lancastrian forces at the brutal Battle of Towton, one of the bloodiest battles ever fought on English soil. Henry VI, Margaret of Anjou, and their son were forced into exile. For a while, it seemed like the war was over. Edward IV ruled for nearly a decade, bringing a measure of stability. But the drama was far from finished. Edward made a fatal political mistake. He secretly married a commoner, Elizabeth Woodville, enraging his most powerful supporter, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick. Warwick was so influential that he was known as the Kingmaker. Feeling betrayed, the Kingmaker switched sides, allied with his old enemy Margaret of Anjou, and launched an invasion. In an incredible reversal of fortune, Edward IV was forced to flee England, and the bewildered Henry VI was put back on the throne in 1470. This period is known as the readaptation of Henry VI, but Edward was not one to give up. With support from his brother-in-law, the Duke of Burgundy, he returned in 1471. In a whirlwind campaign, he defeated and killed the Kingmaker at the Battle of Barnet, and then annihilated the remaining Lancastrian army at the Battle of Tewkesbury, where Henry VI's son and heir was killed. A few days later, Henry VI himself died in the Tower of London, almost certainly murdered on Edward's orders. The House of Lancaster was effectively extinguished. Edward IV was king once more, and this time there were no rivals left. Or so he thought. Edward's second reign was peaceful and prosperous. He ruled for another 12 years and died in his bed in 1483. But his death plunged the kingdom back into chaos. His heir was his 12-year-old son, Edward V. The boy's uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, King Edward IV's younger brother, was named Lord Protector. And this is where one of history's greatest mysteries begins. Richard of Gloucester is one of the most controversial figures in English history, immortalized by Shakespeare as a hunchbacked Machiavellian villain. The reality is more complex, but what happened next is undeniable. Richard moved swiftly. He declared his late brother's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville invalid, making their children, including the young King Edward V and his younger brother, illegitimate. The two boys were housed in the Tower of London, supposedly for their own protection. Then they vanished. The princes in the Tower, as they became known, were never seen again. Their fate remains a mystery, but the prevailing theory is that they were murdered on their uncle's orders. With the princes out of the way, Richard of Gloucester had himself crowned King Richard III. His reign was short and troubled. Many nobles who had supported his brother Edward were horrified by his actions. The disappearance of the princes cast a dark shadow over his rule, and opposition began to gather. The final Lancastrian claimant was a relatively obscure figure living in exile named Henry Tudor. His claim to the throne was tenuous at best, but with the support of disgruntled Yorkists and French backing, he represented the last hope for those who wanted Richard gone. In August 1485, Henry Tudor landed in Wales and marched into England. The two armies met at Bosworth Field. The battle was a turning point. Several of Richard's key nobles either stood by and watched or outright defected to Henry's side. In a desperate, final charge, Richard III was unhorsed, surrounded, and killed, becoming the last English king to die in battle. With Richard's death, the Wars of the Roses came to a dramatic end. Henry Tudor was crowned King Henry VII on the battlefield itself. To solidify his rule and heal the nation's wounds, he made a brilliant political move. He married Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of King Edward IV. This marriage symbolically united the rival houses of Lancaster and York. Henry even created a new emblem, the Tudor Rose, which combined the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York. A new era had begun. The Wars of the Roses had a profound impact on England. The old powerful feudal nobility was shattered, with many great families wiped out. This allowed Henry VII and his successors to build a new, more centralized and powerful monarchy. The Tudor dynasty, born from the chaos and bloodshed of a 30-year civil war, would go on to produce some of England's most famous and formidable monarchs, including Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. It was a dynasty that would change the face of England and the world forever. Out of that bloody conflict, a new dynasty emerged, the Tudors. And with them, an era of revolution that would change England forever. It all starts in 1485 with Henry Tudor, a relatively unknown Welsh nobleman who defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Crowned King Henry VII, his first job was simple but incredibly difficult: pick up the pieces. England was broke, its nobles were too powerful, and the crown was weak. Henry VII was no glamorous warrior king. He was a shrewd, meticulous, and sometimes ruthless administrator. He was all about balancing the books. He avoided costly foreign wars, levied heavy fines on unruly nobles, and promoted trade, especially the lucrative wool trade. He was obsessed with securing his dynasty, marrying Elizabeth of York to unite the warring houses of Lancaster and York, and carefully arranging marriages for his children. By the time he died in 1509, Henry VII had left a full treasury and a stable, centralized kingdom. He was the foundation on which the dramatic Tudor story would be built. Then came his son, the one we all know, Henry VIII. When he took the throne, he was the total opposite of his father. Young, handsome, athletic, and charismatic, Henry was the ultimate Renaissance prince. He loved hunting, jousting, music, and theology. He was a devout Catholic, even earning the title Defender of the Faith from the Pope for writing a book criticizing Martin Luther's Protestant ideas. For the first 2 decades of his reign, he seemed set to continue his father's legacy, ruling over a peaceful and prosperous England. But there was one problem that overshadowed everything. He needed a male heir. His wife, Catherine of Aragon, was the daughter of the powerful Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. She was intelligent, loyal, and had given Henry a daughter, Mary. But after numerous pregnancies, she had failed to produce a son to secure the Tudor line. Henry became convinced this was a divine punishment. Why? Because Catherine had originally been married to his older brother, Arthur, who died young. Marrying your brother's widow was forbidden by biblical law, and although the Pope had granted a special permission, or dispensation, for their marriage, Henry now believed it was cursed. By the 1520s, Henry was also deeply infatuated with a captivating lady-in-waiting named Anne Boleyn. Anne was clever, ambitious, and refused to be his mistress. She wanted to be queen. This gave Henry the ultimate motivation. He decided he needed to annul his marriage to Catherine so he could marry Anne and hopefully have a son. He asked the Pope for the annulment. Ordinarily, the Pope might have found a way to grant it, but this was no ordinary time. Rome had just been sacked by the armies of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. And who was Charles V? He was Catherine of Aragon's nephew. The Pope was essentially the Emperor's prisoner and couldn't possibly grant an annulment that would disgrace the Emperor as aunt. For years, the Pope stalled. Henry grew more and more impatient. His desire for a son and for Anne Boleyn morphed into a full-blown crisis of power. Who was truly in charge of England? The king or a distant pope controlled by a foreign emperor? Frustrated and emboldened by Protestant ideas circulating across Europe, ideas that questioned papal authority, Henry took a radical step. Guided by his clever chief minister Thomas Cromwell, he decided that if the pope wouldn't give him what he wanted, he would simply remove the pope from the equation. Between 1532 and 1534, a series of laws passed by the English Parliament dismantled papal authority in England, culminating in the Act of Supremacy in 1534. This act declared that the King of England was the supreme head on earth of the Church of England. Just like that, Henry broke with Rome. The English Reformation had begun, not because of a deep theological disagreement among the people, but because of the king's dynastic anxieties and personal desires. He got his wish, annulling his marriage to Catherine and marrying a pregnant Anne Boleyn. This break had enormous consequences. To consolidate his power and, not coincidentally, fill his treasury, Henry turned on the wealthiest institutions in the country, the monasteries. Between 1536 and 1540, he ordered the dissolution of the monasteries. Hundreds of ancient religious houses were closed, their lands and treasures seized by the crown. This was one of the single greatest transfers of wealth in English history. The land was sold off to the gentry and nobility, creating a new class of landowners who now had a vested interest in the new religious settlement. They would never support a return to Rome because it would mean giving up their new property. While this made the crown rich, it also destroyed centuries of culture, art, and learning, and eliminated the social safety net that monasteries had provided for the poor. Despite this dramatic break with Rome, Henry VIII never saw himself as a Protestant in the vein of Martin Luther or John Calvin. He still believed in most Catholic doctrines, like transubstantiation. He had created a sort of Catholicism without the Pope. He executed Protestants who went too far, like Aniskew, but he also executed staunch Catholics who refused to accept his supremacy, like his own friend and chancellor, Sir Thomas More. England was caught in a confusing and dangerous middle ground shaped entirely by the king's will. And what of his personal life? Anne Boleyn gave him not a son, but another daughter, Elizabeth. When she too failed to produce a male heir and was accused of treason, Henry had her executed. Just days later, he married Jane Seymour, who finally gave him what he'd always wanted, a son, Edward. But Jane died shortly after childbirth. Henry would go on to marry 3 more times. Anne of Cleves, a brief political match he quickly annulled. Catherine Howard, who was executed for adultery. And finally, Catherine Parr, who outlived him. 6 wives in total, a story of hope, love, betrayal, and bloodshed. When Henry VIII died in 1547, he left behind a kingdom transformed. He had strengthened the monarchy and the state beyond his father's wildest dreams, but he had also unleashed religious forces he couldn't fully control. His 9-year-old son, Edward VI, inherited the throne. Because Edward was a minor, the country was run by Protestant-leaning advisors, like the Duke of Somerset and later, the Duke of Northumberland. Under their guidance, the Church of England lurched in a truly Protestant direction. Catholic imagery was destroyed. The Mass was replaced with a new English-language service from the Book of Common Prayer, and priests were allowed to marry. These were radical changes, and many in the countryside, still attached to the old ways, resisted them. But Edward was a sickly boy, and he died in 1553 after just 6 years on the throne. His advisors, desperate to prevent a Catholic from taking power, tried to install a Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey, as queen. But the people of England rallied behind the person they saw as the rightful heir. Henry VIII's first child, Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. And with Queen Mary I, the pendulum swung violently back. Mary was a devout Catholic who had seen her mother cast aside and her religion outlawed. She was determined to return England to the Roman Catholic faith. She reinstated the authority of the Pope, reversed Edward's Protestant reforms, and married King Philip II of Spain, another powerful Catholic monarch. But her methods were brutal. To enforce her religious settlement, she began persecuting Protestants. Over the course of her 5-year reign, nearly 300 people were burned at the stake as heretics. This earned her the infamous nickname Bloody Mary. Far from converting England back to Catholicism, the public burnings created Protestant martyrs and fueled a deep-seated anti-Catholic sentiment that would last for centuries. Mary's reign ended in 1558. She died childless, her dream of a Catholic England in ruins. The throne passed to the last of Henry VIII's children, Anne Boleyn's daughter, Elizabeth. By the middle of the 16th century, England was a nation torn apart by religious conflict. The question of faith was no longer just a personal matter. It was the central issue of politics, succession, and national identity. The stage was now set for a new queen who would have to navigate this treacherous landscape and forge a new path for England. This is the Elizabethan Golden Age, from 1558 to 1603. It's an age defined by one remarkable monarch, Elizabeth I. When Elizabeth came to the throne in 1558, England was a nation torn apart by religious strife. Her half-sister Mary had violently tried to return the country to Catholicism. Elizabeth, a Protestant, had a monumental task ahead of her to heal a divided kingdom. Her solution was a masterstroke of political compromise known as the Elizabethan religious settlement. Instead of swinging to one extreme, she forged a middle way. This established the Church of England, or Anglicanism, as the state religion. It was Protestant in its doctrine, but kept some of the familiar Catholic rituals and structures, like bishops and cathedrals. This wasn't a perfect solution, and it didn't please everyone. Radical Puritans wanted more reform, and devout Catholics refused to conform. But for the majority, it brought a much-needed period of stability. This religious peace laid the foundation for everything that was to come. Elizabeth's long reign of 45 years allowed this settlement to take root and become a core part of English identity. With the nation more settled at home, English culture exploded in a spectacular burst of creativity. This was the peak of the English Renaissance, and its genius was everywhere. When we think of this era, one name immediately comes to mind: William Shakespeare. The Bard of Avon was writing his greatest plays, from the tragedy of Hamlet to the comedy of A Midsummer Night's Dream. His works, performed at theaters like the Globe in London, weren't just for the elite. They were mass entertainment for a public hungry for stories. And he wasn't alone. Christopher Marlowe, with his dark and powerful plays like Dr. Faustus, was another giant of the stage. Poetry flourished with writers like Edmund Spenser and Sir Philip Sidney, while composers like William Byrd and Thomas Tallis created music that filled the cathedrals and royal courts with incredible sound. This wasn't just an age of politics and power. It was an age where art and language reached new heights, defining English culture for centuries. London became a bustling hub of creativity, a magnet for artists and thinkers. While poets and playwrights were shaping England's soul, another group of adventurers was busy shaping its future on the high seas. Elizabeth knew that to be a major European power, England needed to command the oceans. She invested heavily in building a modern, professional navy. But official forces were only part of the story. This was also the age of the sea dogs, daring privateers like Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh. These men were part private adventurer, part pirate, and part unofficial naval officer. With the Queen's quiet approval, they raided the treasure fleets of England's greatest rival, Catholic Spain. Spain, under King Philip II, was the world's superpower, fueled by the vast gold and silver mines of its American empire. England's constant harassment of its ships and its support for Protestant rebels in the Spanish-controlled Netherlands made a showdown inevitable. Spain saw Elizabeth's Protestant England as a heretical threat that needed to be crushed. The conflict reached its climax in 1588. Philip launched the Invincible Armada, a massive fleet of 130 ships, sent to invade England, overthrow Elizabeth, and restore Catholicism. It was the moment of truth for England. The entire nation braced for invasion. What happened next became the stuff of legend. The smaller, more maneuverable English ships, commanded by men like Lord Howard and Sir Francis Drake, outfought the larger, clumsier Spanish galleons in the English Channel. They used their superior gunnery and sailing skills to inflict serious damage. Then, a powerful storm, which the English called the Protestant Wind, scattered and wrecked much of the remaining Spanish fleet as it tried to flee around the coast of Scotland and Ireland. The defeat of the Armada was a colossal victory. It didn't end the war with Spain, but it was a massive psychological blow to the Spanish and a huge boost for English morale. It announced England's arrival as a major naval power and secured its independence as a Protestant nation. The victory cemented Elizabeth's image as a great leader, a protector of her people. Fueled by this new confidence on the seas, the English began to look further afield. The age of exploration turned into the first tentative steps of colonization. The dream wasn't just to raid Spanish ships, but to establish English bases in the New World. Sir Walter Raleigh was a key figure here. He sponsored the famous lost colony of Roanoke in the 1580s, an attempt to create a permanent settlement in what is now North Carolina. The colony mysteriously vanished, a cautionary tale about the immense difficulties of colonization. But the ambition didn't die. English merchants were pushing into the Atlantic trade, challenging the dominance of Spain and Portugal. In 1600, Elizabeth granted a charter to a group of investors, creating the East India Company. This seemingly small administrative act would have enormous consequences, laying the groundwork for British trade and eventual rule in India and the Far East. These were the first uncertain steps of what would eventually become the British Empire, a global network of trade and colonies that would shape the modern world. After a long and momentous reign, Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, died in 1603. She had never married and left no children, a choice that had always been a source of political anxiety. Who would succeed her? The succession had been carefully managed. The crown passed to her closest living relative with a strong claim, her cousin, James VI of Scotland. He traveled south to London and became James I of England. This event, known as the Union of the Crowns, was a pivotal moment. For the first time, England and Scotland were ruled by the same monarch, uniting the entire island of Great Britain under a single ruler. This personal union set the stage for the formal political union that would create the Kingdom of Great Britain a century later. The Elizabethan era was over, but its legacy was immense. Elizabeth had taken a fractured second-rate kingdom and turned it into a confident, culturally vibrant and powerful nation poised on the edge of becoming a global empire.
This is the era of the Stuarts, a time of civil war, regicide, and a bold, if short-lived, Republican experiment. So grab your popcorn, because this story has more twists than a blockbuster movie. Our story begins in 1603. Queen Elizabeth I, the last of the Tudors, dies without an heir. The crown passes to her cousin, James VI of Scotland, who now becomes James I of England. This event is known as the Union of the Crowns. For the first time, one monarch ruled both England and Scotland. It sounds like the birth of Great Britain, right? Well, not quite. James was king of two separate kingdoms, each with its own laws, parliament, and church. Imagine being the CEO of two rival companies at the same time. That was James's challenge. He dreamed of a truly united kingdom, but deep-seated national rivalries and legal differences meant that dream would have to wait. James I was a fascinating character. He was an intellectual, a believer in the divine right of kings, the idea that his authority came directly from God and that he was answerable only to God. This didn't sit well with an English parliament that had grown accustomed to having a say in how the country was run, especially when it came to money. This fundamental clash between royal authority and parliamentary power would define the entire Stuart century. Religion was the other powder keg. England was officially Protestant, but there were many factions. You had Puritans who felt the Church of England was still too Catholic, and you had actual Catholics who were viewed with deep suspicion. This suspicion exploded in 1605 with the infamous Gunpowder Plot. A group of provincial English Catholics, led by Robert Catesby, planned to blow up the House of Lords during the state opening of Parliament, assassinating King James and most of the Protestant aristocracy in one fiery blast. Their plot was foiled at the last minute when Guy Fawkes was discovered guarding barrels of gunpowder in the cellars beneath Parliament. The event is still commemorated in Britain every November 5th with bonfires and fireworks, a stark reminder of the intense religious tensions of the time. While drama unfolded at home, England was also looking outward. In 1607, a small group of adventurers established a settlement on the coast of North America. They called it Jamestown, in honor of the king. This was the beginning of permanent English colonization in the New World, a tiny seed that would eventually grow into the United States of America. It's a crucial moment, linking the political turmoil in England to the dawn of a new empire across the Atlantic. When James I died in 1625, his son, Charles I, inherited the throne and all of his father's problems. But Charles lacked his father's political pragmatism. He was even more committed to the idea of the divine right of kings, and he had a knack for alienating just about everyone. He clashed with Parliament constantly over money. He needed funds for his foreign policies, but Parliament refused to grant them without concessions. Frustrated, Charles decided to rule without them, embarking on an 11-year period known as the personal rule. He raised money through old, obscure, and deeply unpopular taxes, like ship money, which traditionally was only levied on coastal towns for naval defense. Charles demanded it from everyone, inland and out. This was seen as a flagrant abuse of royal power and an illegal tax by many. Charles's religious policies were just as inflammatory. With his Archbishop, William Laud, he pushed the Church of England in a more ritualistic, high church direction, something that looked suspiciously like Catholicism to the Puritans. When they tried to impose a new, English-style prayer book on fiercely Presbyterian Scotland in 1637, the Scots rose in rebellion. The Bishops' Wars, as they were called, were a disaster for Charles. He was forced to recall Parliament to ask for money to fight the Scots. But this Parliament, later known as the Long Parliament, had a long list of grievances and was in no mood to cooperate. Instead of granting funds, they began to dismantle the machinery of Charles's personal rule, arresting his key ministers and passing laws to curb his power. The situation spiraled out of control. Trust between the king and Parliament completely broke down. In January 1642, Charles made a fatal miscalculation. He marched into the House of Commons with an armed guard to arrest 5 of his leading parliamentary opponents. They had been tipped off and had already fled. This unprecedented act of aggression shattered any remaining hope of a peaceful resolution. It was seen as a direct assault on the liberties of Parliament. The king fled London, and both sides began to raise armies. The English Civil War had begun. The country was torn in two. On one side were the Royalists, or Cavaliers, who supported the king. They were strong in the north and west of England and tended to be from the traditional landed aristocracy. On the other side were the Parliamentarians, or Roundheads, so called for their close-cropped haircuts favored by Puritans. Their strength lay in the south and east, including the wealthy city of London. For years, battles raged across the English countryside, from Edgehill to Marston Moor. Families were divided, and towns were besieged. It was a brutal, devastating conflict. Initially, the Royalist forces had the upper hand, thanks to their experienced commanders. But Parliament had a crucial advantage: control of London and the navy, which meant they controlled the nation's wealth. Their fortunes truly turned with the rise of a man named Oliver Cromwell. A gentleman farmer and a devout Puritan, Cromwell was a military genius. He helped create the new model army, a professionally organized, highly disciplined, and ideologically motivated fighting force. Unlike earlier armies, promotion was based on merit, not social status. These soldiers believed they were fighting God's war against a tyrannical king. The new model army proved unstoppable. At the Battle of Naseby in 1645, they crushed the main Royalist army. King Charles I eventually surrendered to the Scots in 1646, who then handed him over to Parliament. But what do you do with a captured king? This was uncharted territory. Negotiations dragged on, but Charles, ever defiant, believed he could play his enemies off against each other. He even managed to stir up a second brief civil war while under house arrest. For Cromwell and the army leaders, this was the final straw. They concluded that there could never be peace as long as Charles Stuart, that man of blood, was alive. In an act that shocked all of Europe, Parliament set up a special court to try the king for treason. The trial was revolutionary. The king refused to recognize the court's legitimacy, asking, "I would know by what power I am called hither." The answer was simple, yet profound: he was called to account by the people of England. On January 30, 1649, King Charles I was found guilty and led to a scaffold erected outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. He was beheaded in front of a stunned crowd. With the monarchy abolished, England was declared a republic, a commonwealth and free state. This was a radical experiment. For 11 years, England was ruled without a king. Power initially lay with a Council of State and a rump parliament. But real power rested with the army and its leader, Oliver Cromwell. The early years of the Republic were spent crushing royalist rebellions in Ireland and Scotland, campaigns known for their particular brutality, especially in Ireland. Governing a republic proved even harder than winning a war. The remaining parliamentarians were fractious and ineffective. In 1653, frustrated by their lack of progress, Cromwell marched into Parliament with soldiers and dismissed them, famously saying, "You have sat too long for any good you have been doing lately. In the name of God, go." He was then installed as Lord Protector, making him a king in all but name. The Protectorate was essentially a military dictatorship under Cromwell. He was a complex figure, a religious zealot who also championed a degree of religious toleration, a regicide who ended up ruling like a monarch. He tried to bring about a godly reformation, but faced constant opposition from all sides. When Cromwell died in 1658, his son Richard briefly succeeded him, but he lacked his father's authority. Without Cromwell's powerful personality holding it all together, the Republican government quickly collapsed. The army fell into factions, and the country drifted towards anarchy. The people, weary of military rule and political instability, yearned for a return to the old ways. In 1660, a restored parliament invited the exiled son of the executed king, Charles II, to return and take the throne. The monarchy was restored, and the great Republican experiment came to an end. But the world had changed forever. The execution of a king and the 11 years of Republican rule shattered the myth of the divine right of kings in England. It established the principle that a monarch could not rule without the consent of Parliament. The seeds of modern constitutional monarchy and parliamentary democracy were sown in the blood and turmoil of the English civil wars. It was a brutal, chaotic, and transformative chapter that redefined the relationship between the people and the state, setting the stage for the future of England and, indeed, the world. It's a story of kings returning, disasters striking, and a power struggle that would redefine England forever. So, picture this: it's 1660. The grim, puritanical rule following the Civil War is over. The people are tired of it, and they want their king back. Enter Charles II, the merry monarch. He returns from exile, and for a moment, it feels like a party. Theaters reopen, life gets a lot more colorful, and the monarchy is officially restored. But don't be fooled by the celebrations. The old wounds from the Civil War, those deep-seated tensions between the king and Parliament, and between Protestants and Catholics, haven't gone anywhere. They're just simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to boil over again. Charles is a savvy political operator. He knows he can't rule like his father, Charles I, who, you'll remember, lost his head. He has to play a careful game with Parliament, who now holds the purse strings and isn't afraid to use that power. Just as London was getting back into the swing of things, disaster struck. Not once, but twice. In 1665, the Great Plague swept through the city. It was a terrifying epidemic, a return of the Black Death that had haunted Europe for centuries. People fled the city in panic, houses were marked with red crosses, and the death toll was catastrophic. It's estimated that a quarter of London's population perished. Then, just as the city was recovering, a small fire started in a bakery on Pudding Lane in 1666. Within days, it became the Great Fire of London. This inferno raged for 4 days, destroying over 13,000 houses, 87 churches, and St. Paul's Cathedral. The medieval heart of London was reduced to ash. But from these ashes rose a new city. Architects like Sir Christopher Wren were given a blank slate. They rebuilt London with wider streets and buildings made of brick and stone instead of wood, transforming the cityscape and making it safer. Wren's masterpiece, the new St. Paul's Cathedral, became a symbol of London's resilience and rebirth. Now, let's get back to the politics. Charles II managed to navigate the tricky political landscape for his entire reign, dying in his bed in 1685. He even secretly converted to Catholicism on his deathbed. The real problem started with his successor, his brother, James II. Unlike Charles, who was cautious about his faith, James was an open and devout Catholic. This set off alarm bells across Protestant England. Remember, this is an era where religion and politics were completely intertwined. To the English elite, a Catholic king meant a threat to their property, their power, and their Protestant way of life. They looked across the Channel to France, where King Louis XIV was an absolute monarch, and they feared James wanted the same for England. James started appointing Catholics to high office, ignoring laws passed by Parliament, and maintaining a large standing army. It felt like a deliberate march towards Catholic absolutism, and the political establishment was not having it. The breaking point came in 1688. The unthinkable happened. James's wife gave birth to a son. Suddenly, the prospect of a long line of Catholic kings ruling England became very, very real. Before, the elites had been willing to wait it out, knowing James's Protestant daughter, Mary, was next in line. But a Catholic heir changed everything. So, a group of powerful Protestant nobles took a massive gamble. They secretly wrote a letter to Mary and her husband, William of Orange, who was the leader of the Dutch Republic and a champion of the Protestant cause in Europe. They invited William to invade England and rescue it from James's tyranny. William gathered his fleet and army, and in November 1688, he landed in England. What followed was less of a war and more of a political coup. James's support crumbled, his army deserted him, and he eventually fled to France. Because this transfer of power happened with almost no bloodshed, it came to be known as the Glorious Revolution. This revolution was a monumental turning point. William and Mary were offered the crown, but not without conditions. In 1689, they had to agree to the Bill of Rights. This was not just any document, it was the foundation of modern British democracy. The Bill of Rights firmly established the supremacy of Parliament over the monarch. It declared that the king could not suspend laws, levy taxes, or raise an army without Parliament's consent. It guaranteed free elections, freedom of speech within Parliament, and protected citizens from cruel and unusual punishment. The divine right of kings was dead. From now on, the monarch would rule by the grace of Parliament, not by the grace of God. England was now a constitutional monarchy, a system where the power of the ruler is limited by law. This was a radical idea at the time and would become a model for governments around the world, including the founders of the United States. The Glorious Revolution also unleashed a wave of innovation in politics and finance. With a stable and predictable government backed by Parliament, people felt more confident investing their money. This period saw the formal emergence of political parties, the Whigs, who generally supported Parliament's power, and the Tories, who were more supportive of the monarch. Their debates and rivalries shaped political life. Critically, in 1694, the Bank of England was founded. This wasn't just a place to store money, it was a revolutionary institution that allowed the government to borrow huge sums of money to fund its wars, particularly against France. This financial revolution gave Britain a massive advantage over its rivals and helped fund the expansion of its navy and future empire. The final major piece of the puzzle in this era was the unification of the kingdoms. For centuries, England and Scotland had shared a monarch but remained separate countries with their own parliaments and laws. Tensions often ran high. But by the early 1700s, both sides saw advantages in a fuller union. The English wanted to secure their northern border and ensure the Protestant succession in Scotland. The Scots, facing economic hardship, were tempted by the prospect of access to England's growing trade and colonies. So, in 1707, the Act of Union was passed. It dissolved both the English and Scottish parliaments and created a new, single Parliament of Great Britain at Westminster. The Kingdom of Great Britain was born. This union laid the groundwork for the next century, where Britain would rise to become a dominant global power. So, to recap this whirlwind half-century, we started with a king returning to the throne, but we ended with Parliament firmly in the driver's seat. We saw London devastated by plague and fire, only to be reborn stronger than before. And we witnessed a bloodless revolution that created a new kind of government, the birth of modern finance, the rise of political parties, and the creation of Great Britain. The stage was now set for the 18th century, an age of empire, industry, and enlightenment, all built on the foundations laid during these turbulent but transformative years. Great Britain, shot to global prominence, only to face a stunning setback that would change the world forever. So, what's the big picture? In 1707, the Acts of Union officially joined the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of Scotland, creating the Kingdom of Great Britain. This wasn't just a name change, it was the birth of a new political and economic powerhouse. This new state immediately found itself locked in a series of epic conflicts, primarily with its old rivals, France and Spain. The War of the Spanish Succession, which was already raging, was just the beginning. These weren't just European squabbles, they were global chess matches played out across oceans and continents for control of trade routes and colonial territories. Back at home, the royal family tree got a major shakeup. In 1714, queen and, the last of the Stuart monarchs, died without a direct heir. The crown passed to her nearest Protestant relative, a German prince who became King George I. This marked the beginning of the Hanoverian dynasty. Now, not everyone was thrilled about a German king who barely spoke English. This discontent fueled the Jacobite cause, supporters of the exiled Stuart family who believed they were the rightful rulers. The Jacobites launched several dramatic uprisings, most famously in 1715 and again in 1745 with Bonnie Prince Charlie. These rebellions were romantic, heroic, and ultimately, tragic failures. The Hanoverians crushed them, cementing their hold on the throne and signaling the end of the Stuart dream. With a stable, if not universally loved, monarchy in place, Britain turned its focus outward. The 18th century was the age of sail, and Britain was determined to rule the waves. The government and private investors poured money into building the Royal Navy, transforming it into the most powerful naval force in the world. Why? Because a strong navy protected trade, and trade was the engine of Britain's growing wealth. A vast network of global trade routes was established, connecting Britain to the Americas, Africa, and Asia. This period saw the rise of what historians call the First British Empire. However, we have to address a dark and crucial part of this economic success: the transatlantic slave trade. British ships dominated this horrific system, forcibly transporting millions of enslaved Africans to the Americas to work on sugar, tobacco, and cotton plantations. The immense profits generated from this brutal exploitation flowed back to cities like Liverpool, Bristol, and London, funding industrial development and fueling the lavish lifestyles of the elite. It's a grim and undeniable truth that much of Britain's newfound wealth was built on human suffering. The rivalry with France reached its peak in the 7 Years' War, which erupted in 1756. You might know it as the French and Indian War in North America. This was arguably the first true world war, with fighting in Europe, North America, India, and the Caribbean. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The outcome was a spectacular victory for Britain. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 was a moment of absolute triumph. France was forced to cede almost all of its North American territories, including Canada, to Britain. Britain also made significant gains in India, laying the groundwork for future colonial rule there. At this moment, Britain stood as the world's undisputed colonial superpower, its empire stretching across the globe. It seemed like the British Empire was invincible. But as the saying goes, pride comes before a fall. The very victory that made Britain so powerful also sowed the seeds of its greatest crisis. The 7 Years' War was incredibly expensive, and the British government was drowning in debt. Looking at their vast new territories in America, Parliament thought it was only fair that the colonists should help pay for the soldiers stationed there to protect them. So, they started imposing new taxes, like the Stamp Act and the Tea Act. From the American colonists' perspective, this was an outrage. They had no representatives in the British Parliament, so they argued it was a violation of their rights as Englishmen. Their rallying cry became, "No taxation without representation." Tensions escalated quickly. Protests, boycotts, and events like the Boston Tea Party pushed both sides further apart. Britain saw it as a rebellion to be crushed, the colonists saw it as a fight for freedom. In 1775, the simmering conflict exploded into the American Revolutionary War. What began as a colonial uprising soon became another global conflict, as Britain's old enemies, France and Spain, eagerly joined the fight on the American side, seeking revenge for their earlier defeats. The war was long, costly, and humiliating for Britain. The powerful Royal Navy was stretched thin, fighting on multiple fronts, and the army struggled to control a vast and hostile territory thousands of miles from home. The breaking point came in 1781 at the Battle of Yorktown, where a combined American and French force trapped the main British army, forcing its surrender. It was a devastating blow. Back in London, support for the war collapsed. In 1783, with the signing of another Treaty of Paris, Britain officially recognized the independence of the United States of America. The loss of the 13 colonies was a profound shock to the British system. It was a massive economic loss and a huge dent in national pride. The invincible empire had been defeated by its own subjects. This moment forced a major rethink of what the British Empire was and where it was going. It marked the end of the First British Empire, which had been primarily centered on the Atlantic and the Americas. But this wasn't the end of the story. Far from it. As we'll see in our next episode, Britain would pivot, turning its attention eastward towards India and the Pacific. The loss of America was a bitter lesson, but it also spurred the creation of a second, even larger, British Empire. The 18th century closed with Britain battered but not broken, a global power that had been humbled but was already adapting and preparing for a new century of imperial ambition. Picture this, it's the late 1700s in Britain. The world is on the brink of a revolution, but not the kind fought with muskets and cannons, at least not at first. This was a revolution of steam, iron, and coal. This was the Industrial Revolution, and it kicked off right here in Britain, turning the nation into the workshop of the world. So, what exactly happened? It all started with textiles. For centuries, people had spun wool and cotton by hand in their cottages. Suddenly, new inventions like the spinning jenny and the water frame appeared. These weren't small household tools, they were massive machines that needed their own buildings. And so, the factory was born. To power these new machines, inventors harnessed the incredible force of steam. James Watt's improved steam engine in the 1780s was a game-changer. It wasn't just for factories, it could pump water out of coal mines, allowing miners to dig deeper for the very fuel that powered the revolution. Coal and iron became the twin pillars of this new industrial age. Britain had plenty of both. Iron production boomed, creating the raw materials for everything from bridges and buildings to the machines themselves. The landscape of Britain started to change dramatically. Canals were dug to transport heavy goods like coal and iron across the country, creating a network of waterways that were the highways of their time. This new infrastructure was crucial, connecting the mines to the factories, and the factories to the ports. The social fabric of the country was completely rewoven. Before this, most people lived in rural villages, working the land. But the factories needed workers, thousands of them. This sparked one of the largest migrations in British history, as people flocked from the countryside to the rapidly growing cities like Manchester, Liverpool, and Birmingham. These cities became bustling, often chaotic, centers of industry. Life for these new city dwellers was tough. They lived in crowded, often unsanitary housing, and the work in the factories was long, dangerous, and monotonous. We're talking 12 to 14-hour days, 6 days a week, in noisy, hazardous environments. This was a completely new way of life, and it created new social classes. A powerful industrial middle class emerged, the factory owners, the inventors, the entrepreneurs who were reaping the financial rewards of this new economy. They built grand houses, invested in new ventures, and started to demand more political power. Below them was the vast, and growing, urban working class, or proletariat. These were the men, women, and even children who toiled in the factories and mines. Their lives were precarious, and their shared struggles in these new urban environments began to forge a new sense of identity and solidarity. As you can imagine, this rapid, unplanned change brought massive social problems to the surface. The working conditions were appalling. Child labor was rampant, with children as young as 5 or 6 working long hours in dangerous jobs. Issues of pollution, disease, and crime plagued the new industrial cities. These problems didn't go unnoticed. Voices for reform began to rise, calling for government intervention to protect workers, improve living conditions, and grant more people the right to vote. The political pressure was building, setting the stage for major social and political battles in the century to come. Now, while Britain was undergoing this radical transformation at home, it was also fighting for its very survival abroad. Just across the English Channel, the French Revolution had exploded in 1789, overthrowing the monarchy and sending shockwaves across Europe. The monarchies of Europe, including Britain, watched in horror. They feared these revolutionary ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity would spread to their own lands. Britain soon found itself at the head of a series of coalitions, funding and fighting against revolutionary France to contain the chaos. Then, a figure of immense ambition and military genius rose from the ranks of the French Revolution, Napoleon Bonaparte. By the early 1800s, he had crowned himself emperor and set his sights on conquering Europe. For Britain, this was an existential threat. Napoleon's ambition was to dominate the continent, and Britain, with its powerful navy and growing industrial might, was his primary obstacle. The conflict became a classic showdown, the whale versus the elephant. Napoleon's seemingly invincible army dominated the land, while Britain's Royal Navy ruled the seas. Napoleon knew he couldn't invade Britain as long as the Royal Navy controlled the Channel. His plan was to lure the British fleet away and destroy it. This led to the legendary Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. Off the coast of Spain, Admiral Lord Nelson led the British fleet to a spectacular and decisive victory against the combined French and Spanish navies. Nelson famously signaled to his fleet, "England expects that every man will do his duty." He was mortally wounded in the battle, but his victory was total. Trafalgar shattered Napoleon's naval ambitions and ensured British naval supremacy for the next century. The threat of a French invasion was over. With the sea secured, Napoleon tried to cripple Britain economically through his continental system, a Europe-wide embargo on British goods. But Britain's industrial economy, its global trade network, and its powerful navy allowed it to withstand the pressure. The wars dragged on for years, fought on battlefields across Europe, from Spain to Russia. Britain's role was often to provide financial subsidies to its allies like Austria, Prussia, and Russia, and to engage the French in a grueling war on the Iberian Peninsula, led by the Duke of Wellington. During this period of intense conflict, a major political change occurred back home. In 1801, the Act of Union was passed, formally joining the Kingdom of Great Britain with the Kingdom of Ireland. This created a new entity, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. This union would shape the political landscape and the course of Irish history for the next 120 years. The long struggle against Napoleon finally reached its climax in 1815. After escaping from his first exile, Napoleon returned to France for a period known as the 100 Days, rallying one last army. The Allied forces, led by Britain's Duke of Wellington and Prussia's Gebhard von Blücher, met him on a field in modern-day Belgium. The place was called Waterloo. The battle was a close-run thing, as Wellington himself described it. But in the end, the Allied forces held firm, and Napoleon's army was defeated for good. His final surrender ended more than 2 decades of near-constant warfare. So, by 1815, Britain emerged transformed. It had survived the colossal struggle against Napoleon and stood as the world's leading naval and colonial power. But just as importantly, it had become the world's first industrial nation. The steam engines, the factories, the sprawling cities, these were the foundations of a new era of British power and influence. The period from the 1780s to 1815 was a crucible, forging a new Britain, a nation that had not only defeated a would-be conqueror of Europe but had also unleashed an economic force that would change the entire world.
From 1815 to 1901, Britain didn't just change, it exploded onto the world stage, creating the largest empire history has ever known, while wrestling with dramatic changes right at home. Imagine a world where one country rules the waves so completely that it ushers in a century of relative peace, at least for itself. After the defeat of Napoleon in 1815, this was Britain's reality. The Royal Navy was unmatched, and this dominance fueled a global trading network that made Britain the workshop of the world. This era was called the Pax Britannica, or British Peace, and it was the foundation upon which an empire was built. Throughout the 19th century, that empire grew at a staggering pace. It wasn't just about a few scattered colonies anymore. We're talking about the vast subcontinent of India, huge swaths of Africa carved up in the scramble for Africa, and strategic footholds across Asia and the Pacific. By the end of the century, the saying "the sun never sets on the British Empire" wasn't just a boast. It was a simple statement of fact. From Canada to Australia, from Hong Kong to South Africa, British influence was everywhere. This expansion brought immense wealth and power to Britain, but it came at a tremendous cost to the colonized peoples, a legacy of exploitation and conflict that echoes to this day. At the heart of this era was one figure, Queen Victoria. Her reign, from 1837 to 1901, was so long and influential that it gave the entire period its name. Victoria became more than just a monarch. She was a symbol. She represented a set of values: duty, family, respectability, and morality that became the hallmark of the age. This Victorian morality was a powerful force, shaping everything from art and literature to social etiquette. She and her husband, Prince Albert, projected an image of a stable, domestic family life that stood in stark contrast to the scandals of previous monarchs. For many Britons, Queen Victoria was the embodiment of the nation and its imperial destiny. But while the empire was expanding abroad, Britain was undergoing a revolution at home. The old political system, where power was held by a tiny landowning elite, was bursting at the seams. A series of landmark laws, known as the Reform Acts, began to change everything. The Great Reform Act of 1832 was just the beginning. Over the decades, the right to vote was gradually extended to more and more men, first to the middle classes, and later to working-class men in the cities and countryside. This didn't happen overnight. and it certainly didn't include women yet, but it was a radical shift. Politics was no longer a gentleman's club. Mass political parties like the Liberals and Conservatives emerged, needing to appeal to millions of new voters. Modern politics, with its campaigns, rallies, and promises, was born. This political upheaval was driven by the engine of the Industrial Revolution. Cities like Manchester, Liverpool, and Glasgow swelled to unprecedented sizes as people poured in from the countryside looking for work in factories and mills. But this rapid urbanization created immense problems. Overcrowded slums, poor sanitation, and dangerous working conditions were the reality for millions. Think of the world Charles Dickens described in his novels. That was the dark underbelly of Victorian progress. In response to these conditions, new movements for social reform began to gain momentum. Campaigners fought for better public health, demanding clean water and proper sewer systems to combat diseases like cholera. The Factory Acts aimed to limit working hours and improve safety for laborers, including women and children. There was a growing recognition that the state had a responsibility to its citizens, leading to the first steps towards public education and a basic social safety net. These weren't easy victories. They were hard-fought battles between reformers, factory owners, and politicians. One of the most persistent and painful issues within the United Kingdom was the Irish question. Ireland had been under British rule for centuries, but in the 19th century, the relationship reached a breaking point. The Great Famine of the 1840s, a catastrophic event that led to the death of 1 million people and the emigration of another million, left a deep and lasting scar. The famine exposed the brutal inequalities of the land system and fueled a powerful movement for Irish nationalism. Throughout the rest of the century, Irish leaders agitated for land reform and, most importantly, for home rule, the right to govern their own affairs. This struggle would dominate British politics for decades and set the stage for Ireland's eventual fight for independence. So, how did the Victorians see themselves? On the surface, it was an age of incredible self-confidence. They saw their empire, their industry, and their political system as the peak of civilization, a model for the rest of the world. This belief in progress and superiority was everywhere, from grand exhibitions of technology to the poetry and art of the time. However, beneath this confident exterior, there were growing anxieties. Thinkers like John Ruskin and William Morris criticized the ugliness and dehumanizing effects of industrial society. Others began to question the morality of imperialism, pointing out the violence and injustice required to maintain the empire. These critiques were often on the margins, but they were there, planting the seeds of doubt that would grow in the century to come. The Victorian era was a paradox, an age of unprecedented power and wealth built on a foundation of deep social tensions and moral contradictions. It was an era of reform and repression, of supreme confidence and nagging doubt. Understanding this complex period is key to understanding the world we live in today. From the shape of global politics to the ongoing debates about social justice and the legacies of empire. The 20th century dawned with Britain at the pinnacle of global power, its empire spanning a quarter of the world's land. Yet, The next 7 decades would be a period of unprecedented turmoil, one that would see Britain fight for its very survival, lose its empire, and completely reinvent itself from the inside out. This is the story of a nation winning wars, but losing an empire and building a new kind of society from the ashes. The fuse was lit in 1914. When war broke out in Europe, Britain, as a leading Allied power, plunged into what became known as the Great War. Millions of men were sent to the trenches of France and Belgium, and to fronts across the globe. The conflict was unlike anything seen before, a brutal meat grinder of industrial warfare. Battles like the Somme and Passchendaele became synonymous with unimaginable slaughter, leaving scars on the national psyche that have never fully healed. By the time the guns fell silent in 1918, Britain and its empire had suffered immense casualties. The country was victorious, but it was also exhausted, grieving, and deeply in debt. The world it had dominated was changed forever. The years between the wars were far from peaceful. The roaring 20s gave way to the crushing weight of the Great Depression in the 1930s. Mass unemployment and economic hardship gripped industrial areas, while Britain's empire was still vast. Controlling territories from India to Africa, cracks were beginning to show. Nationalist movements gained strength, demanding on the international stage. A new and darker threat was rising in Europe with the ascent of fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany. Faced with the horrors of the last war, British policy, led by figures like Neville Chamberlain, was one of appeasement, trying to avoid another conflict by giving in to Hitler's demands. It was a policy born of a desperate desire for peace, but it would ultimately fail to prevent an even greater catastrophe. In September 1939, that catastrophe arrived. Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland forced Britain to declare war. The early years were disastrous. France, Britain's main ally, fell in a matter of weeks in 1940, leaving Britain to stand alone against the might of the Nazi war machine. This was Britain's darkest hour, but also its finest. Under the defiant leadership of Winston Churchill, the nation refused to surrender. The Royal Air Force fought and won the critical Battle of Britain, preventing a German invasion. Then came the Blitz, where German bombers relentlessly pounded British cities, night after night. Civilians on the home front showed incredible resilience, holding firm until the tide of the war began to turn, with the entry of the Soviet Union and the United States into the war. The alliance was forged that would eventually crush the Axis powers. After 6 long years of global conflict, Britain once again emerged victorious in 1945. But the price of this victory was staggering. The country was financially bankrupt. Its cities were in ruins, and its position in the world was irrevocably weakened. The end of the war unleashed a force that could no longer be contained: decolonization. The idea of a British Empire, already challenged before the war, now seemed unsustainable for a nation that was economically shattered and had just fought a war for freedom and self-determination. The jewel in the crown, India, was the first major domino to fall. In 1947, after a long struggle for independence led by figures like Mahatma Gandhi, Britain partitioned the subcontinent into India and Pakistan. This event triggered a wave of independence movements across the globe. Over the next 2 decades, one by one, colonies in Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean gained their freedom. The vast British Empire, which had defined the nation for centuries, dissolved with astonishing speed. Britain had to find a new role for itself, no longer as an imperial superpower, but as a middle-ranking European nation. While the empire was disappearing abroad, a quiet revolution was taking place at home. The shared sacrifice of the war had created a powerful desire for a fairer, more just society. In the 1945 general election, the British people voted for a radical change, electing a Labour government with a landslide majority. This government embarked on one of the most ambitious social engineering projects in modern history, the creation of the welfare state. Its goal was to protect citizens from the cradle to the grave. The cornerstone of this new system was the National Health Service, the NHS, established in 1948. For the first time, healthcare was made free for everyone at the point of use, regardless of wealth. Alongside the NHS came a comprehensive system of social security, unemployment benefits, and a massive program of building public housing. This was a new social contract, a promise that the state had a fundamental responsibility for the welfare of its people. As Britain adjusted to its post-imperial status, it had to navigate the new geopolitical landscape of the Cold War. The world was now dominated by 2 superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Firmly siding with its wartime ally, Britain became a key member of the Western Bloc. It was a founding member of NATO, the military alliance designed to counter the Soviet threat, and developed its own nuclear deterrent. This alignment with the US defined its foreign policy for decades, as Britain sought to maintain influence on the world stage, even as its old imperial power faded into memory. It was a difficult transition, learning to be a junior partner rather than a global leader. The 1960s and 70s brought further dramatic changes, this time cultural and social. The swinging 60s saw London become a global hub of fashion, music, and youth culture, epitomized by bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. It was a period of significant social liberalization, with new laws on divorce, abortion, and homosexuality, reflecting a more permissive and modern society. However, this cultural dynamism was set against a backdrop of growing economic trouble. The post-war boom was over. The 1970s were marked by economic crises, high inflation, and widespread industrial unrest, with powerful trade unions clashing with governments. This period, known as the Winter of Discontent, led to a profound sense of national uncertainty and doubt about Britain's future direction, setting the stage for yet another radical transformation in the decades to come, from the peak of empire to the struggles of a post-imperial nation. The period from 1901 to 1979 was one of profound and often painful transformation for Britain. It fought and won 2 devastating world wars, only to find itself weakened and bankrupt. It lost a vast empire, but built a pioneering welfare state in its place. It transitioned from the world's sole superpower to a key player in a new world order, defined by the Cold War. This turbulent journey shaped the Britain we know today, leaving a complex legacy of pride, loss, and resilience that continues to influence its identity and its place in the world. It's a story of revolution, division, and reinvention. So, Buckle up as we dive into modern Britain. Our story begins in 1979 with the election of Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady. Facing economic stagnation and industrial unrest, she unleashed a free market revolution. State-owned industries like British Telecom, British Gas, and British Airways were privatized. The power of trade unions, which had dominated post-war politics, was decisively curbed through tough new laws. Financial markets were deregulated, turning the City of London into a global powerhouse. Thatcher's goal was to create a dynamic, competitive enterprise culture. The effects of Thatcherism were profound and divisive. On one hand, inflation was brought under control, and the economy was fundamentally a new class of shareholders emerged, and entrepreneurship was encouraged. But on the other hand, the human cost was immense. The decline of traditional industries like coal mining and shipbuilding led to mass unemployment, particularly in the north of England, Scotland, and Wales. Social inequality soared, creating deep regional divides that still persist today. The 1984-85 miners' strike became a symbolic and bitter battle, a clash between the old industrial Britain and Thatcher's new economic vision. For many communities, the scars never fully healed. While Britain was undergoing this internal revolution, its relationship with Europe was also evolving. The UK had joined the European communities back in 1973, but it was often seen as an awkward partner. Thatcher famously battled for a rebate on Britain's budget contributions, declaring, "I want my money back." Despite this friction, Britain's economy became increasingly integrated with the continent through the single market, which was established in the late 80s and early 90s. The Maastricht Treaty of 1992 officially created the European Union, deepening political and economic ties, but also fueling a growing skepticism within parts of the Conservative Party. Thatcher's reign ended in 1990, partly due to internal divisions over Europe and her deeply unpopular poll tax. After a period under John Major, a political earthquake happened in 1997. Tony Blair and his new Labour Party swept to power in a landslide victory, ending 18 years of Conservative rule. Blair promised a third way, blending the market economics of Thatcherism with a renewed commitment to social investment. His government poured money into public services like the NHS and education, introduced a national minimum wage, and pursued social reforms. One of New Labour's most significant constitutional changes was devolution. In 1999, power was transferred from Westminster to new legislative bodies: the Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh, the National Assembly for Wales in Cardiff, and the Northern Ireland Assembly in Belfast. This was a historic decentralization of power designed to give these nations a greater say in their own affairs and address growing nationalist sentiments. However, as we'll see, it also set the stage for future constitutional debates, particularly concerning Scottish independence. The early 2000s were dominated by the War on Terror. Following the 9/11 attacks in the United States, Tony Blair forged a strong alliance with U.S. President George W. Bush, and Britain joined the US-led invasions of Afghanistan in 2001 and, most controversially, Iraq in 2003. The decision to go to war in Iraq based on contested intelligence about weapons of mass destruction, was deeply divisive. It led to massive public protests and damaged Blair's reputation and public trust in government, leaving a long and complex legacy on Britain's foreign policy and its role in the world. The sunny optimism of the new Labour years came to an abrupt end with the 2008 global financial crisis. The crisis exposed the vulnerabilities of the deregulated banking system that had fueled much of the economic growth. The Labour government under Gordon Brown bailed out several major banks to prevent a total collapse. In 2010, a new Conservative-led coalition government came to power under David Cameron, promising to fix the nation's finances. Their solution was a program of austerity, deep cuts to public spending aimed at reducing the national debt. These cuts affected everything from local councils and police forces to welfare benefits, sparking widespread debate about fairness and their impact on the most vulnerable. Austerity created a tough economic climate, but it also coincided with a new political storm brewing. Europe, for decades, Euroscepticism had been a powerful undercurrent in British politics, particularly on the right. Concerns about immigration from new EU member states in Eastern Europe, combined with a sense of lost sovereignty and a desire to take back control, grew louder. The UK Independence Party, or UKIP, led by Nigel Farage, began gaining significant traction, putting immense pressure on the Conservative Party in an attempt to resolve the issue once and for all. And see off the UKIP threat, Prime Minister David Cameron made a fateful promise. If he won the 2015 general election, he would hold an in-out referendum on Britain's membership of the European Union. He won, and the stage was set for one of the most consequential decisions in modern British history. The 2016 referendum campaign was passionate, divisive, and often bitter. The Remain side argued for the economic benefits of EU membership, warning of the risks of leaving. The Leave campaign, led by figures like Boris Johnson, focused on sovereignty, immigration control, and the promise of a brighter future outside the EU. On June 23, 2016, the British public delivered their verdict by a narrow margin of 51.9% to 48.1%. The United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union. The results sent shockwaves across Britain, Europe, and the world. David Cameron resigned as Prime Minister the next day. What followed was a period of unprecedented political turmoil. Theresa May became Prime Minister and triggered Article 50, the formal process for leaving the EU. Her mantra was Brexit, means Brexit. But what did that actually mean? The UK was deeply divided. Parliament was deadlocked over the terms of the withdrawal agreement May had negotiated with the EU. There were multiple general elections, parliamentary defeats, and constant political drama. The country was split between Leavers and Remainers, and the debates were intense and emotional. Finally, after Boris Johnson won a large majority in the 2019 general election on the promise to get Brexit done, the UK formally left the European Union on January 31, 2020. This marked the end of 47 years of membership. A new trade and cooperation agreement was put in place, establishing a new, more distant relationship with the EU. Brexit has reshaped Britain's economy, trade, and its place in the world. Its long-term consequences are still unfolding. The exit from the EU didn't solve Britain's big questions. In many ways, it amplified them. The issue of the Irish border, a key sticking point in the Brexit negotiations, remains sensitive and complex. In Scotland, where a majority voted to remain in the EU, the Scottish National Party is pushing for a second independence referendum, arguing that Brexit has fundamentally changed the constitutional settlement. Immigration continues to be a central and often contentious political issue. And so, Britain, in the early 21st century, finds itself at another crossroads. Having undergone the Thatcherite Revolution and spent nearly half a century inside the European project, it is now forging a new path. The debates over its identity, its role in the world, and its own internal unity are more intense than ever, from the Iron Lady to Brexit. This has been an era of constant, often turbulent transformation. The one thing that seems certain is that the future of Britain will be as dynamic and unpredictable as its recent past. Thanks so much for watching this series on the history of Britain. If you've enjoyed this journey, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history. Let me know your thoughts on modern Britain in the comments below. See you next time.